louder? By speaking into it like this, does that help? Turned on, it's got a light on. Let's try that one. Is that one any better? Yes. Thanks. Great. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for coming. My name's Will. I'm going to be chairing this session. We've got about 2 hours. Before I introduce the speakers, I just want to run past an idea for you for the second half, so you can think about it while we're seeing the presentations. So, Medact are interested in trying to put together a documentary about or using the story of the Ebola crisis in West Africa to talk about the social and economic determinants of health. And that fits quite well with this set of presentations because these are about how to use film to talk about issues that are difficult to get across, like inequality. So for the second half of this session, we've got two options really. One is that we just carry on with the Q&A based on Katharine and Jason's films. And the other option is that we start maybe in groups, smaller groups, thinking about how Medact could put together that kind of documentary and thinking through the first steps of what it might look like. So what I think we'll do is have the two presentations, have a short Q&A, and then maybe take a vote on whether people want to carry on with the Q&A or try and think about a film. If we want to think about a film, we'll have to find a way of working in groups in this heavily steeped lecture theatre, but I'm sure we can find some way of doing it. So think about that while you're watching the films, about whether you want to carry on with the Q&A or not. So first off, Katharine Round is a producer and director. She's made films for BBC and Channel 4, ITV, Discovery, and her latest project is, of course, the Spirit Level documentary she's going to tell us about now.
Okay. Hello, can everyone hear me? Say yes. Okay, great. Thanks, Will. As he said, I'm directing the Spirit Level film. Have any of you heard of this film at all? Yes, you have. Okay, good. Basically, I'm going to outline the story of how this film came to be, the process that we've gone through, and really what we're trying to do in terms of engaging people with important issues that can often be quite complex to non-specialist audiences. This is not a film for a specialist audience. This is intended to engage ordinary people with some of the sort of broad ideas as to how health outcomes and many other outcomes in society can be linked to the bigger economic structure in which we live. I'm going to first of all, hopefully this will work, show you the trailer for the film, which is our current trailer. Hopefully it will work.
Sorry, do you know if we can do it right?
I don't know about that actually. Shall we do that first? Is it on this thing? The sound for this might be a bit low as well. For some reason, this is the one clip for which the sound doesn't seem to be quite as good as the other one, unfortunately.
They just dimmed, right?
That's dimmed. How do you? Okay, you do that to prove it that's down.
So then you can go back to full if you want after.
Okay, cool. Let me start this again. Hopefully, you can get the gist of it from this.
I did think that the free market, that it would produce the resources that could make everybody better off.
Well, it's taken 10 or 15 years for people to really wake up to, including us, but I mean to wake up to what's been happening with income distribution.
People at the top of the income ladder have gotten all the income gains that have occurred during the last 30 years.
I say this is not how capitalism works. This is how capitalism goes hopelessly, disastrously wrong.
If there is this big difference, some people are worth everything and other people are worth nothing, where do you come? And I thought, aha, that's it. That's going to explain it. The low-grade people have less control.
People look on your own. Is that all you do? No, that's not all I do.
You can murder the souls of people by treating them as less worthy than other people.
I'm just angry, I'm just upset, I'm just like, I don't know where it's come from. we've got very confused about what our identities really are. We measure ourselves so much in terms of consumption.
Where do I stand in relation to this person? Where do I stand in relation to these other people? Where do I stand in relation to my community?
Kind of bizarre to be kind of looked at as the poor people in the neighborhood.
Now that was my eureka. Oh my God, this is not simply about poverty.
Okay, hopefully that was good enough for most of you. Is it better if I have the lights a bit up? Yeah. Okay, I thought that afterwards. Yeah. As you may know, the book, The Spirit Level, was a big success. It was out in 2009 and 2010, and basically my side of the story began around that time when my partner gave me the copy of the book and said, "Read this. You've got to make a film of it." Sadly, said that about lots of books since, so I haven't yet finished this one yet. So, I mean, it was a book that I'd heard of, and it was an incredibly interesting story, but an incredibly complicated and difficult story to convey in a sort of normal storytelling device. The book had been a huge success. I mean, it sold at that point, I think, over 100,000 copies, not including the US. It had received positive reviews across the press. All political persuasions were taking on this idea that the growing gap between rich and poor was something that we needed to be concerned about. So basically, this is an overview of the achievements. I was sold on the idea of making a film. Of course, I had no money, and no one was going to commission a film on something as complicated and intractable in their view as how the economic system affects health outcomes and all other aspects of our life. So I had to think of another way. I passionately believe that there's a way of conveying this so that people will engage with it on a very human level. So it did give me a fantastic amount of freedom. And here's a picture of me at the time. The idea to launch a crowdfunding campaign was based around the sort of thought that we knew that there are plenty of us out there that are interested in this subject. We felt there could be an audience for this film. We felt there could be a way of getting this film out there, and we felt we could make a film that people would engage with. Of course, if it was wrong, then the crowdfunding wouldn't work, and we'd have to sort of all go and hang our heads in shame. But I'm going to give you a little overview of the crowdfunding process, because a lot of people do ask me about it, and I know it's slightly different than the subject, but it's quite an interesting one to think about in terms of how it can be used to mobilise social movements and to start getting projects like this off the ground. Basically, we started off thinking, well, how much money do we need to make this film? I mean, the actual truth of the matter is to make this film was a huge cost, because it's incredibly ambitious. It involves filming around the world and, with all manner of people from all different walks of life, and a lot of quite heavy-duty research beforehand. So, of course, that kind of money was out of range for a crowdfunding campaign, but that didn't mean that we couldn't make an incredibly powerful start. So our budget for this film is a terrifying £450,000, which we're not even close to raising yet. But we have raised a substantial portion of it and got very far down the line. But for our first crowdfunding campaign, we aimed for 30, because that would get us to a very key milestone in the film. It would enable us to shoot some of that crucial footage across the UK and some of the US, and therefore have some material that we could show people what we were doing. So, I mean, how are we going to do it? Basically, a lot of it is partnership building, which I'm sure is something that you're all familiar with. I mean, there was a lot of interest groups, a lot of people that are interested in this subject. It covers, of course, health, but there's also lots of other work that's being done, both in terms of the economic side of things, child poverty, looking at crime outcomes. So my job was really to kind of talk to all the people that were involved in all this different work and kind of find a way of bringing us all together so that we could kind of get behind something like this. So, you know, between us, we planned how we'd reach people. You know, that's, you know, things like mailing lists, blogs, articles. You know, later down the line, we did a few other things, like we devised an inequality test so that you can see how you stand compared to the 0.01%, which I can categorically tell you everyone in this room will be terrible. You know, it was a sort of group process, really. You know, of course, had to make a trailer. It's a very early stage trailer, much less advanced than the one I've just shown you. But what it did do was enable us to have an ask to sort of explain that if we were making the film, this is what our aim was with it. That's what we could achieve. Of course, after all this work, it could still go terribly wrong. And that was a terrifying moment. So, you know, the day before the launch, it was a pretty nerve-wracking moment for me. I really did think that there was a possibility it might fail. So the day of the crowdfunding launch, this is our little graph that shows that first day, and it was extraordinary, actually. Within one day, we'd reached $10,000 when our goal was $50,000, which is about £30,000. Which never in my wildest dreams would I have thought that, you know, it was possible to achieve that much of the goal in that one day. And I think it really showed, actually, it was a real kind of proof that there were enough people that were interested in this subject, that this was something that people would get behind. You know, in the first couple of hours, we'd raised half of that. We'd raised about 5,000. And I think, you know, it really does show how working together we can achieve something quite powerful. By the end of the campaign, we had reached our goal. We'd reached more than our goal, which was brilliant. And it was a crowd of quite a substantial number of funders, over 1,000. And since then, we've done 2 other crowdfunding campaigns to kind of get us to different parts of the film, and they've both really helped us to achieve that. But it's obviously not just about raising money for the film. You know, sort of not just a byproduct, but part of our campaign was that we really wanted to keep people talking about inequality, and we really wanted to start, you know, getting this message further and further into the press. And you know, there was a lot of publicity around the time. Obviously, there's The Guardian, even the US website Boing Boing, False Economy, all talking about it and bringing the message out to more people. So. Obviously, we were able to start making the film. Here's me with my cameraman, DOP. And, you know, we knew there was an audience for this film. But, of course, you know, having an audience for this film doesn't mean that you have a film. So our next question was, how do you make a film that is going to resonate with ordinary people and get them to understand a bit more about what inequality does to each of us in our lives? I have two ways I'm combining this in the film. One is through an intellectual detective story. This is big picture analysis. These are people sort of telling the story of how we got from where we were to where we are today. You know, includes figures like Michael Marmot, Robert Frank, James Gilligan, economists at the IMF, Ha-Joon Chang, you know, a number of leading figures who've all kind of plotted the changing sort of dynamics of our economy over the last 35 years. But alongside that, the heart of the film actually comes from real stories and real people and their lives. One of the things that I was most struck by reading the book, even though I sort of come from a statistical background and found the graphs absolutely fascinating, was actually what those graphs represented, which was real people and real lives. And I thought that if we could kind of somehow unabstract that information and show some of the psychological and behavioural processes that are really going on and get people to care about what is happening to people, get people to really sort of understand where this is coming from, not just as you know, statistics are very, very important, very powerful, but you know, to kind of have a slightly different take on it and really feel the impact of the income gap. Then we could perhaps convey how this might have the outcomes in health and crime and community that we were seeing. So this wasn't an easy task, of course. Spent a lot of time. I did 2 separate trips. The first one was in the UK. Spent a lot of time working with communities across the UK, trying to hear really how people felt that their lives have been impacted. And it's tough because, of course, people are some people are very angry. Some people they don't know why. And it's not just necessarily people at the lower end of the income spectrum. It's happening to people at all sides of the income spectrum. The first clip, I'm only going to be able to show a couple of clips because the film is actually in the edit at the moment, so we don't have a film. We have lots of bits of film. So what I've tried to do for this presentation is just show a little flavour of a couple of the characters and a couple of the key pieces of argument that we're going to be weaving in along the way. So bear in mind when you watch this, this is not intended to be the film. It will be weaved together in a slightly different way to how these clips are presented, but this is really just to sort of start showing you how we're kind of representing some of the evidence and some of the ideas. So the first clip I'm going to show you is a guy called Darren, if he works. Darren was brought up in the outskirts of Glasgow in an area called Pollock. Darren, very eloquent young man, and he essentially conveys in his own words how feeling poor has an impact on our well-being, both physical and mental. And he is, relatively speaking, at the lower end of the income spectrum, but he's very aware that even at the lower end of the income spectrum, it's still a relative concept. And the desire to sort of maintain status happens at the bottom as well as at the top. So I'm going to show you a little bit of Darren now, hopefully, if you work. So I'm going to take these lights down. First of all, here we go. Is that all right? Yeah?
Well, I mean, I fit all the stereotypes. And that's quite painful. I'm 29, I've had a drink problem, I've had a drug problem, I've been homeless. Even in my own community, I've been regarded as aggressive, a troublemaker, a bully. On all the beats. Glasgow City. You only know you're poor when you have other things to compare yourself to, and I'm only realising it now, the level of fear that I have about this world and society and the people in it. My mother came from a horrendous background. It makes an Irving Welsh novel look like a tabloid cartoon, do you know what I mean, to be perfectly frank. There was a lot of financial pressures just permeate everyone's life. You never really knew what was going to happen, and that creates a lot of uncertainty. No one wants to admit they all live in a deprived community, so everyone's spending their money on this so they can go out and go, I'm not poor, but everyone is poor, you know. It's silly. Alcohol gave me what I thought was confidence. You know, it's a wonderful drug in terms of an anaesthetic to emotional pain. So it's a painkiller for your spirit, really. My biggest ambition in life, try to get through a day. So this is where I had my first drink outdoors. It was cold and quite boring, but it was right here. Right here. I think now my dad probably knew what I was doing, but it wasn't an issue. You know what I mean? Your audience are coming from the slums and you're coming with a trust fund. Turn our nose up, chum, get me down till I'm as paranoid as 'cause every day I the time. If you don't like it, write it down and post it to the depths of your soul. We're true, you've lost it. Have you heard that song yourself? No one would have wanted it. I'm just angry. I'm just upset. I'm just like, I don't know where it's come from. and it just gave people the real wrong idea. I fooled people so well that they thought that I actually believed that stuff about myself, and so they had every right to think I was a prick. If I make it to 70, I'll be lucky, and that's if I eat salad every day, you know, and exercise. So like, I'm 30 coming up for, and I might not even have another 30 years to live at this current level. Now my life's not even got started yet.
Okay, so that's Darren. And Darren wasn't the only person I filmed in the UK. I filmed a number of different people in different scenarios across the UK. I mean, Darren obviously speaks to some of the sort of health outcomes and some of the links between the stress of his particular position and his own life and lifestyle and sort of and life expectancy and sort of various health outcomes there. After filming in the UK, the biggest challenge was then getting to the US. I mean, the US was always going to be the big challenge in terms of this particular film, because obviously getting over there is quite a big effort, both financially and in terms of logistically. And it was 5 different stories that I was looking to film from East Coast to West Coast. So that obviously meant working very late. And then, you know, one of the most important things in this film is that I want to stress is that it's not just about being poor. This is about looking at how economic inequality impacts people on all different parts of the income spectrum. And this was in the US, specifically looking at various different areas where this would happen, one of which was on Wall Street, and not just how Wall Street was a sort of the engine of rising inequality in some senses, but also how that impacted on people who were working in it or who were sort of linked to that world. And, you know, the sort of it's quite stark actually in the US. I think the UK obviously has a very huge amount of inequality, but in the US it is incredibly apparent the divides between the haves and the have-nots, and the sort of lack of safety net there, and how quickly you can go from being in one position to being in another position. And I have to say, you know, I've spent time in the US, but sort of on this particular shoot, going from all the different people that I was with, it was incredibly kind of overwhelming actually to realise quite how divided a country it is. So 2 people that I filmed in the US I've put together in a little clip to show you, to try and give you a little bit of a flavour of what we're kind of getting through their characters. In New York, I was filming with a couple called Alden and SIMA. Alden works in Wall Street. He actually is a psychologist who all of his clients are Wall Street workers, and there's a huge amount of mental breakdown happening on Wall Street at the moment. His wife, SIMA, who is in this clip, you know, she essentially comes from a sort of fairly sort of comfortable background. She enjoys the social comfort provided by their lifestyle, the ported building. She wishes to move to a gated community, all very reasonable things in their lives. And, you know, I just thought it was interesting to contrast their thoughts on community and their lifestyles with that of LEAH, who's at the other end of the income spectrum. She works in the fast food industry, in a sort of, she calls this community where she lives the hood, but it's a sort of poorer area basically, which is very, very strong in community, but very prone to sudden outbreaks of violence. And she herself has serious, severe health problems, including congestive heart failure. She lost her mother at a younger age. There's a lot of illness that pervades her life. So I just wanted to show you a clip that contrasted their views of community with each other, but also I think gives an insight also into some of the sort of stressors that are encountered by people at both ends of the income spectrum, and how that might play out into their health impacts, into the impacts on their health as well. So let me just see if I can get this to work. Okay, is that okay? Yep. Oops, sorry, wrong one.
It's a great day at KFC. May I help you? Cold beer after work is just like, soaking your feet. And as far as this gotcha paper, this is our weekly, I want to say, incident paper. People that have done things over the course of the week or 2 weeks to get arrested.
I don't think.
And sometimes I be looking in here for my son's little friends because I don't want none of them be having no fugitive while I'm in there cooking. Hot and alcohol and, you know, just pure.
Oh, sorry. I've now messed it up.
You know, wanting what somebody else has.
Good, baby. Thank you. Hey, baby, you do too. Look, I'm sick of it. I'm stressed out. I can't do it. And you're paying $200 for the light bill, and your cable bill and your phone bill is like $2-something, and you're only bringing in an $800 check every 2 weeks. Like, we can live off of that, really? This is why all these young kids, look at this crap. All this shit is just devastating. Look at it. Look at me.
Thank you. Keep them around your neck, please.
Now you can stay the weekend. I'm gonna bring God to her because she.
We having chili dogs tonight.
I kind of have always sheltered myself and kind of lived in the doorman building or, you know, a gated community. So I try to kind of keep myself safe. I'm home a lot with the kids, you know. Alden works pretty late. So it just makes me, you know, sleep easy at night that there's somebody watching over us. That it's without him working that hard, we wouldn't be able to afford our dream.
It's past 9 o'clock, we ain't going out here. Well, I ain't. They can take their chances if they want to, but I'm not moving. I don't trust none of them. It was a little boy that was about 16, and he was out at 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and he got shot to death. There is no safe place anymore. It's nowhere to say, well, I can live in this gated community and it's gonna be safe. No.
Hang on, I think I've lighting. Here we go. So, as you can see, two actually remarkably similar in a way views, but very different sort of pressures on those two individuals and families. I mean, obviously I spent quite a long time in various different communities, both at the top of the income spectrum and at the bottom of the income spectrum. And, you know, I was very keen to make sure that, you know, we did obviously include those who were in the sort of middle and slightly upper incomes as well. You know, certainly in America, chasing the American dream and status competition is a sort of big part of the story. And, you know, certainly fuels anxiety and in some cases consumerism as well. So the second to last clip I'm going to show you is a bit of analysis. I'm going to show you 2 bits of analysis now, because they're characters who will follow and hopefully empathise with and start to understand some of the issues that are affecting their lives. But alongside this, there is also a whole seam of analysis and piecing together the puzzle, so to speak, as to how these various people have got to where they are. This clip, which I've called Red Pills and Blue Pills, is basically contrasting the work of Michael Marmot, who we have here, and his own discovery about how health is impacted by status with that of James Gilligan, who's a prison psychiatrist, who explains how his discovery about how violence is fueled by feeling worthless and disrespected. I have put these clips purely together for this presentation. I think some of the sound is still a bit rough and ready, and I apologise for the last clip being quite low, and I hope you could understand it. So let's give this one a shot.
A psychiatric patient would come in and say, my son's in jail, my daughter's in trouble, my husband beats me, and the doctor would say, well, why don't we change the red pills to the blue pills? That didn't seem to me like the best approach to solving that problem.
Before I started working in the prisons, I just took it for granted that these people were untreatable, incurable, they had no conscience, they wouldn't tell the truth, they just try to manipulate me. It would be impossible to accomplish anything with them, and that they were just outside the range of normal humanity.
And at the time, the conventional wisdom was that high-status people have more heart attacks because they have more stress. Very stressful to be up there at the top.
When I would ask them why they had assaulted or even killed someone, I would get the same answer back again and again. It was because he disrespected me.
When I started looking at the Whitehall data, the striking thing was the mortality from heart disease. Not only was it not higher at the top, but the lower you were in the social hierarchy, the higher the mortality from heart disease.
And I'm suggesting that a person's net worth, in that sense, in our very materialistic society, has a profound effect on the person's sense of self-worth.
The executive at the top has a lot of demand and a lot of responsibility, but he or she has a lot of control over what they do. And I thought, aha, that's it. That's going to explain it. The low-grade people have less control. Now that was my eureka. Oh my God, this is not simply about poverty.
So I think of the pathogen not as a bacteria or a bacillus of some sort, but rather as an emotional experience of feeling disrespected, humiliated, treated as worthless or inferior. You can murder the souls of people by treating them as less worthy than other people are.
So the crucial eureka for Michael Marmot, and indeed for many other people in the film, being that health outcomes and many of the other social outcomes were not caused by absolute poverty, but by relative poverty. Very important revelation in this film, and one of the building blocks to understanding why health and social outcomes are weakening even in rich developed countries where wealth is obviously high, but inequality is very high. So, I mean, although the health impacts at the bottom are more pronounced, the psychological and behavioural effects at the top are not small either, as well as, of course, the pressures of maintaining position in an ever more precarious economic structure. One of the messages that has come across is that increasing economic distance between people also increases a sense of social distance between people and a sense of otherness, and that can have profound impacts both, of course, in our individual happiness and life, but also in terms of creating empathy gaps, whereby the way that we view other people is sort of driven by this seeing of people as other and not quite similar to us. The final clip that I'm going to show looks at this phenomenon and basically contrasts the work of Paul Piff, who is a psychologist and who's been looking at the impact of empathy gaps in widening in countries with widening income gaps, and his work is contrasted with the experience of two people who worked on Wall Street. Hopefully.
what we saw in 2007, around the time of the financial collapse, can be attributed to a lot of different reasons, but one of the big ones is not only that in systems of wealth and in institutions of wealth, there's a prioritization of self-interest above and beyond the welfare of other people.
The difference between the way people on Wall Street talk about things inside the bank and the way they talk about it when they come and talk to government, they say, oh, we're about moving the economy forward, and we're about making sure everyone has access to credit, and we lift everyone's boats up, and we provide credit to the underserved. And when you go on the trading floor, it's all about ripping people off.
I wasn't actually performing a service, I was just legally stealing.
The monopoly study is a study that we ran as a way of setting up, in the context of a lab, a model for what inequality might look like in the real world. So what we did was rig a game of Monopoly. My big question was, what happens? What are the kinds of attitudes that people start taking on, even though at the beginning of the game, at the very outset, it's explicitly rigged?
Whoever's at the top sets the rules.
Very quickly, you see the roles start to crystallize. You see the poor players start to take on some of the behaviors that we see in actually poor individuals in society, and wealthy people take on in the game some of the behaviors that in other studies we've observed actually wealthy people exhibit.
They may or may not acknowledge that as greed, but it's definitely about winning.
Smack the board with their piece a lot louder, making their presence known.
Once you have successfully cleaved off ethical considerations, you're incredibly efficient.
They're more likely to be demonstrative of their material success by fanning out their money on the table.
The aspiration of a lot of people on Wall Street is to have fuck you money. And fuck you money is the amount of money so vast that you could pick up the phone or say fuck you to whoever you wanted without repercussion. And that's a really juvenile thing to want. It's basically wanting to behave with impunity to other people. And so that's the aspiration of a lot of people on Wall Street. It's not just about being wealthy. And that, I think, is a very poisonous drive.
The higher up you are relative to others around you, the far less empathetic you become. So really, as the ladder, as the social ladder gets stretched apart, further and further and further apart, the wider these differences will be and have become between those that have and those that don't in society.
And then when the financial crisis hit, I started to feel really uncomfortable, and I asked my boss, will the public ever forgive us for this? And meaning the bailout. And he basically said to me, well, here's the thing. The public always forgets.
Quite terrifying. So, I mean, I've been filming for the last year and a half or so, and that's just a very, very small flavour of some of the material that we have and some of the analysis and a few of the characters that will be in the film. So I hope you got a little bit of an insight into sort of how we're slightly piecing together the film, where we're at the moment. This is actually where we're at the moment. This is the edit for the film, all the different little pieces and stories and nuances that we are weaving together to create the story. I mean, it's an incredibly exciting process actually putting this film together. I mean, it does bring together a huge number of very, very interesting narratives and areas and people. It's quite complex, but you know, it's very, very. I think it will be very powerful. And our plans are to release it next year, hopefully before May, with an aim to affect, obviously, public attitudes and public policy. And why do we think it might be successful? I mean, of course, you never know whether a film's going to be successful. There's, you know, it's almost impossible to predict. But working in this area and working on films that are deliberately designed and aimed to create social change, we've learnt, myself and my colleagues have learnt a few things that do help to make these films successful. One of which is having a wide and active support from organisations and civil society, be those charities, NGOs, organisations, community organisations, and we're very lucky that we have designed this film from the beginning, aiming to sort of involve these groups, and have kept, hopefully I feel, kept them engaged every step of the way. A substantial social media and PR campaign. I mean, obviously this is something that we're building on. We have obviously got sort of broad interest online, and timing. So, I mean, I think, you know, luck and timing are probably two of the, you know, regardless of how much work you put in, are two of the most important things. And, you know, my belief is the time is right for this film. I mean, barely a week goes by without a new announcement being made about, you know, inequality. The World Economic Forum just the other day was announced that the world leaders' biggest worry was rising inequality in the developed world. And the IMF have spoken out several times, and indeed are in this film. So I don't think this is an issue that's going to go away. And I think, you know, having a film like this is a sort of important way to broaden the debate and to take the debate obviously out to people like ourselves. We're quite an unusual group of people in that we do know a bit more about the subject than your average person. But you know, this film hopefully will not only enable us to continue the work that we do, but also to take it out to other people who might not necessarily think they have an interest in inequality, but certainly to get them engaged with some of the ideas about how the bigger picture is impacting on our lives. And that's it, really. That's all I want to say. I mean, obviously, we do visit the website, thespiritleveldocumentary.com. We are still, I should give a little plug, of course, we are still accepting pre-orders of the film as a way of fundraising. So, you know, if you are able to support us, then please do. Every penny really does help. And if you've got any questions, then please do ask. I'm not sure if we're doing the Q&A now or at the end. So, at the end. Okay. And I'll hand over to Jason. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Katharine. That was excellent, thank you. So yeah, so we'll have questions after Jason's presentation. So Jason Hickel is an advisor to the rules, an anthropologist at the LSE, and he developed this short film about inequality, which has since had about 500,000 YouTube views. And does it have subtitles?
It does not have subtitles. No, I'm sorry. I'm just gonna try to get out of this. Okay, I just want to give you a sense briefly about how the next 20 minutes are going to unfold. So I'm first going to show you the film that we made, which is about 5 minutes long. And I'll tell you a bit about the story that lies behind the making of the film to give you a sense for how we did it. And then finally, I'll spend some time discussing the theory of inequality that the film tries to advance. And I'll talk a bit at the end about how that relates to impacts on public health. So a little bit of background on the film before I show it. In November 2012, an anonymous person called Politzane posted a 6-minute video on YouTube that used very low-budget infographics to illustrate the shocking extent of wealth inequality in the United States. Did you guys ever see this video by any chance here? I get a sense, a few people. It was really popular in the States. I mean, it got 16 million views. So it was it was surprisingly popular for an infographic video, and it had a surprisingly powerful impact on public discourse on inequality in America. So at the time, I remember being really shocked, pleasantly shocked, when I sat in my office and watched this film for the first time, because it appeared so dry and boring and academic, but at the same time, it was going viral, which was amazing. And so it was exciting to me to see that something that had a kind of academic message like this had a lot of sort of popular potential. There was a context to this film that made it so popular, which was partially it came out in the wake of the financial crisis in the US, but also globally, in the wake of the massive bailouts of the big banks in the US and Wall Street, and in the wake of Occupy, the Occupy movement, which got going in 2011. So this kind of rode that wave of discontent about the problem of inequality. So as an academic, I was really thrilled by the prospect that a mass audience would be titillated by nerdy charts and graphs. So my own research at LSE focuses on global inequality. And so I thought, what if we managed to do a similar kind of infographic that built on that momentum of discussions about inequality, but focused the spotlight more on the global situation rather than just focusing on the United States, which is where most of the focus has been, and also in the UK to some extent, but very little on the global scene. So I put together this film, which I guess I'll show you now. People are talking a lot about inequality these days, about the fact that the richest 1% have so much more than everybody else. But most of the focus seems to be on the United States, and it strikes me that the same story needs to be told about global inequality too. So I did some research, and this is what I found from reliable sources like the UN. It turns out that while the US is totally out of whack, things are actually way worse for the planet as a whole. Let's start with this graph. A perfectly even distribution of wealth among all living people, with everyone divided into 5 equal groups. Now, let's show how much each group actually has. Shocking, right? 80% of the world's people barely have any wealth. It's hard to even see them on the chart. Meanwhile, the richest 2%, they have more wealth than half of the rest of the world. Let's look at this chart another way. Let's take the whole world's population, all 7 billion of us, and reduce it to just a representative 100 individuals. Here they are, poorest people on the left, richest people on the right. Now let's show how the world's total wealth, roughly $223 trillion, is distributed. The vast majority have practically nothing. Nothing with which to educate their children, nothing with which to pay for basic medicines. While the richest 1%, they've accumulated 43% of our world's wealth. The bottom 80%, meanwhile, that's 8 out of every 10 people, have just 6% between them. But even this doesn't really show how extreme things have become. The richest 300 people on Earth have the same wealth as the poorest 3 billion. So the number of people it takes to fill a mid-sized commercial aircraft have more wealth than the populations of India, China, the US, and Brazil combined. We can also see this difference geographically, with a huge and growing gap between a few rich places versus the majority of the world. For most of history, things were much more equal. 200 years ago, rich countries were only 3 times richer than poor countries. By the end of colonialism in the 1960s, they were 35 times richer. Today, they're about 80 times richer. Rich countries try to compensate for this by giving aid to poor countries, about $130 billion each year. That's a lot of money. So then why does the wealth gap keep getting bigger? One reason I found is that large corporations are taking more than $900 billion out of poor countries each year through a form of tax avoidance called trade mispricing. On top of this, each year poor countries are paying about $600 billion in debt service to rich countries on loans that have already been paid off many times over. And then there's the money that poor countries lose from trade rules imposed by rich countries to get access to more resources and cheaper labor. Economists from the University of Massachusetts calculate that this costs poor countries about $500 billion a year. Altogether, that's more than $2 trillion that flows from some of the poorest parts of the world to the richest. Every year. Rich governments like to say they're helping poor countries develop. But who's developing who here? This makes me think that there's something wrong with the basic rules of the global economy. It can't be okay that the wealth of our planet is becoming so concentrated in the hands of such a tiny number of people. The only reasonable response, it seems to me, and our only hope, is to change the rules. Okay, so for the most part, this was actually a pretty easy film to make. And this is kind of one of the main points I want to get across to you in this first part, and that's that you do not have to be a professional to put together a film like this and to make it reach a mass audience. So I first came up with the idea while I was driving from Brighton to London one day with my partner Goody. And then I sat down and I wrote the script for the film that very evening, and it didn't take me very long. It was just 600 words, I think. And after that, I storyboarded the film using very simple, just hand-drawn graphs on A4 paper. So I tried to approach the story, the narrative, as if I was teaching a lecture, right, which is what I do for a living. And I guess as I see it, there are sort of two basic keys that make for a successful narrative like this. The first is that you need to start with what you think your audience already assumes about an issue, right? And then demonstrate that standard assumption is somehow wrong. So you want to flip the received wisdom. So in this film, the assumption is that rich countries are helping poor countries, but in reality, it's exactly the other way around, right? And so I think that was quite interesting to people. And the second key is that you need to answer a sort of causal question. So everybody knows there's already really poor countries out there, and the global inequality is getting worse. But the question is why, right? That's the question that people want answered, and that they have assumptions about them, they're probably wrong, et cetera. So the question becomes, what's actually causing this dynamic? And that can be very fascinating for people. And then as soon as you have the storyboard ready to go, you need to find an animator. So I managed to find a guy who was willing to do it for what I consider a bargain price. It was about £800 in total, actually. And the sticker price for an animation of about this length, about 4 minutes, would normally be about £2,000 to £3,000, which sounds expensive, but if you point out that you're doing it for charity, you can often get animators to do it for a lot less. And that's kind of what I did. So if any of you actually get to the stage of ever looking for an animator for a film that you want to put together, please get in touch with me and I can try to hook you up with people that I know that are doing this kind of thing. The only difficult part for me was doing the voiceover. So first of all, you need a decent microphone, which is kind of hard to come by in sort of standard hardware, but you can go to a recording studio at a university or a library or something like that and do it there. And the second thing you need is a recording program. That's easy to come by. Most Apple computers these days have good recording programs that come as part of the standard package. So I think I used one called GarageBand, which is ubiquitous and really easy to use. You have to record the script in a separate file and then send it to the animator to sort of superimpose it over the animation that he or she's put together. So the voiceover for this film took me actually, it took me 6 hours to do, and it's only 4 minutes of voiceover. So that gives you a sense for actually how much work it takes to get the timing and the modulation right, and to get rid of the background noise and so on. So that's not very easy. You can sort of circumvent this problem by hiring your own person to do a voiceover, and that's actually not too expensive. And that way you actually have a normal sounding person rather than a cheesy voice like mine. And I regret doing it because now whenever I hear this film, I cringe. I can't stand it. So anyways, the whole film took me only 2 weeks to complete with the animator, and that was while I was working a full-time job. So again, the point is that it's completely possible for a layperson to do. And if you have an idea for something like this, I definitely encourage you to try it. It's kind of a moment of eureka when you realize, wait a second, I could actually do something like that. I might as well just try and see what happens, right? And the results can be quite impressive. And short videos like these are a very effective way to communicate to a mass audience these days in kind of our internet age, especially if they're relatively short, again, like 3 or 4 minutes, keeps people's attention. I guess kind of the last piece of making the film successful was finding the right networks to send it out to. And the way we did that is we had kind of a big push. We did op-eds in Al Jazeera and Huffington Post that included links to the film. We used Twitter. We sent it to Upworthy, and Upworthy posted it for us. And so all of that kind of gave us a big push in the initial few days, which sent the film kind of viral, at least viral by sort of wonky standards like ours. So we never got 16 million views, but we got 500,000, which was way, way more than I expected. I expected, 1,000 at the very most. I expected to kind of show it to my students, and my students might share it with their mothers or something like that, but that's pretty much it. Okay, so I'd like to move now into talking a bit more about the content of the film. Let's see here. Where do I go? Bottom? Down here. Okay. Okay, cool. Can you guys see that okay? Without dimming the lights? We'll just leave them up. Yeah? Okay. So first of all, I want to point out that inequality has actually become much worse since we released this film just 2 years ago. I mean, the film was released 1 year ago, but the research was done 2 years ago. So the video says that the richest 300 people in the world have more wealth than the poorest 3 billion, right? But the latest figures show that the richest 85 people have more wealth than the poorest 3.5 billion, right? Which is a statistic that's been made popular by a recent Oxfam report that kind of went viral. So as for the reverse flow of wealth, the slide up here will give you an idea for exactly how this works, which is actually much more extensive than what we were able to show in the film for considerations of time and also for complexity, right? So rich countries give 136 billion per year in aid to poor countries on average recently, but then they extract much, much more than this, right? So $1.8 trillion per year in artificially cheap labor. This is called unequal exchange. So if we assumed that people in poor countries should get paid at the same rate for the same productivity as people in rich countries, then this is the gap that's left over for what we trade with poor countries, right? So it's a kind of a hidden transfer of wealth from poor workers in poor countries to rich countries. I'll explain more about how this works shortly. The second big figure is $900 billion per year in trade mispricing, which is a form of tax dodging, and this is a figure that comes from Global Financial Integrity. Another $900 billion per year in transfer pricing, which is another form of tax dodging, and this figure comes from an economist by the name of Raymond Baker. And then, like the film pointed out, $600 billion per year in debt service. This figure comes from the World Bank records. A lot of this debt service is paid on loans that have already been paid off, in some cases many times over. It's essentially just interest on really old loans. And sometimes these debts have been accrued by dictators that were not elected, by popular vote. And so the question is, are these debts even legitimate? Then $480 billion per year in lost potential GDP due to structural adjustment. This figure comes from economists at University of Massachusetts, and I'll talk more about that shortly. And then Christian Aid calculates that 138 billion are lost to developing countries each year in tax holidays extracted by multinational corporations, and that's different from tax dodging. That's essentially a corporation coming into a country and saying, look, if you give us a tax holiday for 5 or 10 years, then we'll come and invest in your country, right? And then $60 billion per year is lost in additional excess patent licensing fees for basic technologies for development like life-saving medicines or basic programs and machines and so on. And this is due to a new agreement in the WTO called TRIPS, which pertains to intellectual property rights. Okay, so these figures alone amount to more than 36 times the size of the foreign aid budget, right? So it's very clear that these flows really dramatically outstrip aid. And that's not counting, right, land grabs. For example, Fred Peirce's book, The Land Grabbers, which came out recently, a few years ago, claims that land the size of Western Europe has been grabbed in the global south in the past 10 years alone, mostly by multinational corporations, okay? That's a huge transfer of wealth that we can't even quantify yet. Then there's privatization. The World Bank records themselves show that the World Bank alone has privatized more than $2 trillion worth of public assets in the global south since 1980. Okay, so that's another huge flow of wealth from public coffers into private hands. And then smaller things like brain drain, illegal logging and fishing, and costs associated with climate change, which are increasing really dramatically. A recent report by Health Poverty Action shows that in Africa alone, losses in these three categories amount to more than $60 billion per year, which is more than twice what the continent receives in official aid each year, right? So you can add this to the figures I listed before, and we're looking at many, many, many times the amount of foreign aid is being extracted from the global south into the coffers of rich countries, sort of secretly, right? Because the global aid budget masks this fact. So the question becomes, who's developing whom here? No wonder global inequality is getting worse. So foreign aid becomes a really powerful kind of PR strategy that masks the actual flow of wealth from poor countries to rich countries, right? So as far as I'm concerned, it's absurd and immoral to believe that charity, which is our present paradigm, that charity is the solution to a problem that is basically about plunder or injustice, broadly speaking, right? So that's a really important point to make. The question I want to address really briefly, I guess I can say this. Foreign aid will never solve the problem of global poverty because it ignores the fact that poverty is actively produced through processes of wealth accumulation in the rich world, right? So charity is, again, an absurd reaction to this. And the only real solution to the intractable problem of global poverty is to dismantle the system of wealth extraction that allows for these reverse flows from poor to rich, right? So the question I want to address briefly, which I think is quite important, is how did this system come into being? What's the history of it? And it kind of happens with the 1973 oil embargo in Arab countries, which is kind of the beginning, in some ways, of the extension of neoliberal policy around the world. So here's really briefly what happened. So the United States gave a bunch of arms to Israel. And in response, Israel's Arab neighbors decided to impose an oil embargo. And this made the US really angry. And the US threatened military action against the Arab states unless they agreed to recycle their petrodollars, their massive new accumulation of petrodollars, through US investment banks on Wall Street. And the Arab countries agreed. And so they in one major disbursement, they gave out $450 billion of petrodollars to the US banks. So the banks then had to figure out what to do with all of this wealth. And the US economy at the time, in the 1970s, was stagnant, as was Britain's economy and much of the developed world. And so the only thing they could do with this excess cash was to spend the money abroad in the form of very high interest loans to poor countries. So banks like Citibank and Chase sent reps all around the world to convince third world leaders, and especially to focus on dictators, to take out these massive high interest loans. Okay? And at the time, this was called go-go banking. If any of you have read the Confessions of an Economic Hitman, this is what he was doing. His job was to give out these high interest loans for totally useless projects a lot of the time. So the assumption was this would be a safe bet, because it was assumed that governments were very unlikely to default on loans. Unlike people, governments couldn't just run away. So you can always get your money back from them. Okay? And the poor countries took loans because they were in desperate need of cash for two reasons. Two big reasons, at least. And one is that they had just emerged from the colonial period, so they were devastated by this period of being plundered by European colonial powers, and they were in desperate need of sort of national development for the first time. And so the loans provided an important source of initial capital for that. And second, because the oil prices were going up because of the oil embargo, they needed extra cash to finance their own basic consumption. Because prices for everything were going up really rapidly, and so they needed these loans just to survive. So the problem with this strategy on the part of the banks was that these loans were made in US dollars, okay? And in the early 1980s, US interest rates massively skyrocketed. They doubled, tripled, quadrupled what they had been before, okay? So developing countries suddenly found themselves completely unable to repay these loans. And starting with Mexico in 1982, they came to the brink of default. And this is what we call the Third World Debt Crisis, 1982. Now, this is where everything began to change. So the debt crisis looked set to destroy the Western banks, and then therefore to sort of ripple through the global economy in a really destructive way. And so the United States made a plan to step in to make sure that Mexico and other countries that were on the brink of default could repay their loans. And this was the plan. They used the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, to roll over the debts of developing countries on the condition that they would agree to a series of structural adjustment programs. Can I get a sense for who knows what structural adjustment is? Okay, about half of you, good. So this sounds like it was a voluntary policy move on the part of developing countries, but in fact it was not. There was always a threat of military invasion by the US if a country decided to default. So defaulting on these loans was an option, technically, and it's what the countries should have done, and the risk would belong to the banks. But instead, the US government threatens, look, if you default on these loans, that means big losses for us, and we're not going to let you do that, and so we'll depose your leaders, we'll invade you, which happened on a number of occasions, right? So this was always a threat, so they had to go along with these structural adjustment programs. So structural adjustment programs have sort of three basic principles attached to them. These are conditions for receiving bailout money, okay? So the first is fiscal austerity, and the idea is you have to cut state spending on public services like healthcare and education. In lots of cases, they go towards what they call cost recovery, which means that they actually make it illegal for a sovereign state subject to a structural adjustment program to have free education and free healthcare, okay? Even if it is feasible for a country to do that, they're not allowed to. They have to do cost recovery, which is crazy. And also cutting government subsidies on farming, food, infant industries, and so on, so that Western goods can compete much more easily with them. The second big principle is to privatize the public sector. This just sounds familiar to those of you who are sort of following austerity policies in Europe. So the idea is to allow foreign corporations to bid on government contracts. This is a big deal with the NHS right now here in England, right? And to introduce PFI and PPP schemes for public services, which again is a kind of a backdoor way of privatization, by loading up public services with tons of debt owed to banks. The third big principle is to liberalize the markets of developing countries. So cut regulations on labor and the environment. So in lots of cases, this meant that if the IMF determined that your minimum wage was too high, they could force you to cut it down, okay? Again, a total violation of the sovereignty of these developing countries that really needed to use these mechanisms to reduce poverty. They had to cut price controls on things like basic foodstuffs, and they had to cut trade tariffs to allow Western goods into their countries, which ended up undercutting local producers, massive decreases in GDP, and we saw wave after wave of riots across the global south against the IMF during this period, during the 1980s and 1990s, as these programs were being unrolled, and as food prices began to skyrocket. So in other words, it was a forced imposition of neoliberalism around the world for the first time ever during those 2 decades. So the consequences of structural adjustment. So the IMF and the World Bank insisted that structural adjustment would be good for developing countries. It would increase their GDP growth, and it would give them more money to spend on paying back their debts. But as it turned out, exactly the opposite was true. What happened was that per capita income growth in the developing world was cut in half. In Africa alone, we saw average GNP, the GNP of the average African country shrank by around 10% during these 2 decades of structural adjustment. And the number of people in absolute poverty doubled, and that's only at the World Bank's very low poverty threshold. At higher poverty thresholds, the poverty rate went up much, much more quickly. But structural adjustment did have the positive effect of benefiting big corporations quite substantially. So we saw Western foreign investment in the third world increase really dramatically, and returns on that investment increased really dramatically too, to the point where in some cases Western corporations were making 20, 30, 40% return on investment because they were able to access such incredibly cheap labor and raw materials from developing countries, right? The wages of plunder. So these same principles were pushed by the WTO, with the idea that in order to gain access to Western consumer markets, poor countries would have to structurally adjust themselves, essentially. They're also pushed by free trade agreements like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, like the TPP, which is forthcoming, Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TTIP agreement, which is a big debate here in Europe, right? So in most of these instances, the reason these programs get pushed successfully is because they're negotiated under very unfair terms. Okay, so at the World Bank, you have the rich countries control the vast majority of the votes in the World Bank. Okay, they have about 15% of the world's population, but they control more than 60% of the World Bank's voting power. Okay, so the developing world, which has the vast majority of the world's population, has a very paltry size of that voting power, which means that anything they want to do gets immediately overridden by the wishes of rich countries like especially the US. Okay. So wrapping up here. So really briefly, the impact on health of structural adjustment is something that I want to emphasize here. So again, structural adjustment forced developing countries to cut their spending on health and use that money instead on debt repayment to rich country creditors. Okay, so the idea is this. So these structural adjustment programs are extremely powerful in the sense that they can force governments to stop spending on some areas and redirect their budget entirely towards debt repayment. Debt repayment has to be the priority in terms of public spending for these countries subject to these programs. Okay, so you see a siphoning of wealth away from the public health sector, away from education, into debt repayment, straight into Western banks. That's one issue. The second issue is that the TRIPS agreement, which I mentioned earlier, in the World Trade Organization, prevented poor countries from manufacturing or importing generic drugs. And this agreement was essentially pushed by big pharma lobbyists in the WTO and resisted extremely heavily by people in developing countries. So the biggest example that I can point to for how this affected poor countries is in Southern Africa, where in most countries in Southern Africa, which is where I'm from initially, I'm from Swaziland, which was very hard hit by structural adjustment. In most countries in Southern Africa, governments were forced to spend more money on debt repayments than on public health services in the middle of the world's worst HIV/AIDS epidemic. Okay, that's where it was worst, and that's also where they were worst hit by structural adjustment. And at the same time, as a result of TRIPS, they were forced to buy patented ARVs, antiretrovirals, at around $10,000 per course, even though at that time there were generic drugs available, totally equivalent, for about $300 per course. Okay, and so as a result, there was almost no mass rollout of ARV treatments during the very height of the HIV epidemic in Southern Africa, leading to millions of needless deaths. So, and this is an argument made by a lot of activists in the Global South that on whose hands is the blood of HIV victims dying in Africa. It's very clear what the distal causes of this epidemic were. It's very popular for people in the West to think, oh, this is a problem of personal responsibility, deviant sexual behavior, and so on. But in fact, no. There's no evidence that there's any less personal responsibility among people in Southern Africa, or even any less knowledge about how HIV is spread than there is here in the Western world. The difference is that they simply don't have a public health system to support them, and they don't have access to basic drugs that today are essentially free and should have been a long time ago. So really briefly, I just want to mention how this applies to the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. So there's a great paper by the People's Health Movement that is up online that you can read. And they give kind of an analysis of some of the distal political causes or structural causes of the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. They point to a number of causes, and I'll mention two up front. And one is that there's this sort of increase again in corporate land grabs in the region that's forcing people off their land and deeper into marginal forest areas where exposure to Ebola carriers like bats is dramatically increased, right? So increased risk as a result of these land grabs as people get pushed off their land. And the second big one that the paper points to very wisely is the impact of structural adjustment. Again, structural adjustment has dismantled public health infrastructure in West Africa. The three countries where Ebola has hit hardest are also the countries that have been hit hardest, at least some of the countries have been hit hardest by structural adjustment and have been subject to a number of IMF programs over the past couple of decades. So this has reduced these countries' capacity to respond to an outbreak that should never have become an epidemic, okay? It's very easy to respond to an Ebola outbreak if you have the right infrastructure and staff, which they simply did not as a result of, at least partially as a result of these policies. The paper also mentions a couple of other important points, and that is that there's this outsized corporate influence in the WTO, which we have to deal with, and then a sort of general for-profit orientation of big pharma research and development. So the vast majority of the money that we're spending on research and development in pharmaceuticals is going towards drugs that have a kind of blockbuster effect on Western markets, right, where people can pay a lot of money for them. And you're not seeing development of basic drugs that people need in poor countries where they just can't pay for them in a kind of profit-making way. And then finally, they mentioned the role of conflict over minerals in West Africa, which is driven again largely by consumer habits in the West, focusing on diamonds and so on, which has caused a lot of displacement from people from their land. Okay, so the point I want to leave you with here is that we know exactly what leads to improved health outcomes in developing countries, and that is better public health infrastructure and cheap life-saving medicines. This is not rocket science. But the rules of the global economy, which are rigged in the interests of rich countries and rich corporations, make this essentially an impossible task to accomplish, or very difficult at least. So it's not a technocratic fix, it's a political fix. We have to challenge the power of certain interests over the global economy before it's going to be possible to redress poor health outcomes in developing countries. And I think this is a crucial point for health professionals in general, and that's that if you're concerned about the Global South and disease in the Global South, then your analysis has to move much beyond the narrow view of biology, right, and individual patient well-being to examine and challenge these sort of broader ultimate drivers that are rooted in the political economy. Okay, and that's all I have.
Great, thank you very much, Jason. That was fascinating, and what a contrast as well between the two films. I think of a very high-budget kind of full-length one that's really telling the story of inequality through stories, versus a very low-budget, taking 2 weeks and focusing much more on the facts. I think so. We've got about probably just over half an hour left, and I think we've got one option, which is to try and start the process of thinking about a film we could make, or Medact could make, with whoever wants to be involved, on Ebola. Jason's last couple of slides were an excellent introduction to that. Or we can have a discussion, a kind of Q&A about the films that we've seen, which could touch on filmmaking or the facts about inequality, or a bit of both. I think let's have a vote on it, if that's all right. So if people who want to do the Ebola film, it will be in groups, thinking through the kind of message we're trying to get across and the way we do it. We'd have a bit more information about Ebola as well. People who'd like to do that option, can you stick your hand up? I'm going to have to count on there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, about 8 people, I think. People who want to do the kind of Q&A, more traditional, talking about the films. I think that won. People agree that won? I think that won. It was fairly close. Is everyone happy with that? Yeah, well, that's true. So I think, for the people who weren't interested in the film, Medact are certainly planning to do it. I think they're planning to do it. So it would definitely be worth leaving your names afterwards. The other thing we could do is start the Q&A, and if maybe have about 15 minutes, and then if there's 15 minutes left, we can move on to Ebola. Does that sound all right? Is that okay, Vic? Okay, cool. Let's do that. In that case, I'm going to sit down. Thanks. Great. Well, let's take questions in groups of about 3, maybe. And if you're able to say who you are as well, and keep the questions fairly short. Start with the woman up there.
Hi, I'm Janelle DeGruchy, and I work in public health in a London borough. Thanks very much. Fascinating presentation, and at a local level with public health now in local government, how you design narrative to engage with not only politicians but local residents. Far more challenging than working in the NHS, I can assure you. So very helpful, really good ideas. 2 questions, very different. The first one was about the spirit level. DARREN, amazing character, wow, so articulate. My question really was, when you're thinking about people who are feeling very disaffected and so on, and the othering is the foreigner, the immigrant, and I just wondered if you have stories that will touch on that, because you're trying to get people an emotion, and yet a lot of the emotion that's been stoked up is about the other, and the whole UKIP phenomenon and so on. So I was just interested in your thoughts about that story. And just my other reflection as I suppose, public health specialist, the last slide, and really, I suppose it's also to bear in mind the rise of commercial determinants, and that non-communicable diseases are the biggest killers in Africa or in the South. And so it's not actually public health infrastructure or those kinds of things that we really need to be tackling, but it's the selling of Coca-Cola and the way in which immunizations were linked to the cold roots of Coca-Cola and distribution, all sorts of things that are going on as well. So I think also just to bring in that analysis about the commercial push into the South and creating markets and selling stuff that's basically killing people.
Thank you. Shall we take a little group of questions? Anyone else? Okay, should we do that? Let's do that and then we'll continue.
I don't know if this actually works. Okay, so I'll try and answer your first question, which is about the sense of other. And absolutely, your point is spot on in terms of how people see others. And I think I am looking for the film to incorporate this. Obviously, it's quite difficult in just short clips to kind of show how that might happen. But certainly, what happens as you see our character stories develop is that we sort of not only get to sort of get an insight into their own worlds and psychologies and sort of how their lives are impacted by bigger things. You know, this is drawing in from you know, both their work, the sort of growing power of the corporate, the financial sector, the housing market, all these different things that impact on all our different characters in different ways. But also you start to see how they see each other, even though they don't know each other. And I think, you know, our characters are in different positions in the income spectrum, and, you know, very much some of the people in the upper income are obviously they're sort of trying to keep out some of the people that we might be learning about and sort of empathising with in another part of the film. And, you know, there are some uncomfortable. It's one of the things that we're thinking about as we're editing it. I mean, you know, a couple of our characters have a couple of some quite uncomfortable views. Certainly, there's one person in this film who I haven't shown you who's actually in a high security prison in Texas, and the amount of racism that goes on in that environment is quite extreme. And it really is about dividing people against each other. And, you know, this is a debate that we're having at the moment about how we get across that aspect of it, because the environment that he's in really does, you know, it makes that possible, it makes that inevitable. And I think, you know, not wishing for any of our characters to be demonised, because they are actually all very likeable, understandable people, but there's certainly, you know, the sort of idea that we're all kind of encouraged to blame each other is a little bit, quite a big part of the film. I hope that makes sense.
I think I can use this. Does this work okay? So I guess it was really more of a comment than a question, but yeah, I completely agree with you. I guess probably the biggest problem when it comes to disease burden in much of sub-Saharan Africa, which is what I know best, is like you pointed out, non-communicable diseases. But it is interesting the way we see sort of negative impacts on our ability to progress against these diseases as a result of structural adjustment. So if you take malaria, for example, in a number of cases, you've had the state have to roll back spending on spraying for malaria, for mosquitoes. And as a result, we're seeing increases in malaria that in places that had basically eradicated it. Another example is TB. So my father is a doctor, and he spent 20 years working in Swaziland, and they spent most of their effort working on combating TB. But then so this is in the 80s and 90s. By the end of the 80s, they had almost eradicated TB from Swaziland. But then as structural adjustment got going in the late 80s and the 90s in Swaziland, then we actually saw TB come back. Okay, so part of that was due to HIV and AIDS, but another part just had to do with a decaying public health infrastructure that was unable to respond to the disease. So there was a hospital my father worked in a very rural area, and when he left that in the 90s, then it was pretty well functioning. And then I went back to visit it recently, a few years ago, and the only drug they had available to patients there was paracetamol, and it was quite shocking to see. So I think another big issue is water privatization, which is a policy of the World Bank that is being very heavily contested right now. And as a result of privatization of basic water resources, we're finding that there's an increase in diseases that should be normally prevented by just basic sanitation, right? And so that's also a really key challenge that I didn't get to mention earlier.
Any more questions? Right at the top, two right at the top.
Hello? Yeah. I was just interested to know your thoughts on, so recently Bob Geldof came out to say that he's going to be releasing Ebola Christmas song. And yeah, I was just interested to know your thoughts on that and how that fits into kind of the narrative of like, the West helping Africa and the inequality in between those things.
Hi, just with the film, The Spirit Level, I was just interested in a couple of things. The first is, obviously you've used the term the spirit level, so just to know how closely you've actually linked it to the book. And the second thing, which I guess is related, is you showed us a series of stories about how life is, rubbish for a lot of people, and that's relatively uncontroversial, and we all know that, and we've all known that for a long time. So the added aspect that I was interested in is, to what extent in the film do you explore, what next? So what do we do with that? Which is obviously a lot more controversial, a lot more open to criticism, a lot more difficult.
Should we take those? Do you want to start with Jason?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so you can probably guess what my views are on Bob Geldof. And on Bono as well. There was a time in my life when I was very excited by people like them, I suppose, in my more naive days, because, it seemed they were doing a good thing, generating public interest in these problems that I cared about, and a lot of you probably care about as well. But the point is that these people are very deeply committed to a kind of charity paradigm, right? This idea that the problems of the global South are somehow out there, separate from the rich world and our lifestyles and our trade pacts and so on. Okay, and this is just fundamentally not true. And so, in some way, it's not just that charity fails to address the ultimate political causes and economic causes that are at stake, but in fact, charity is kind of evil in a way, because it misdirects public attention from what those causes actually are. And so it makes it seem as though the takers, rich countries, are sort of are in fact just givers, as though they're not complicit within a global class divide in some of these problems, right? And so I think that it's fundamentally misguided beyond just missing the point. It actually distracts people's attention and policymakers' attention. So I would be very happy if Geldof would shut up. But on the Ebola issue, I don't know. I don't know this issue very well, so maybe it's possible that his efforts will improve the situation. But again, I think it's distracting from some of the ultimate causes that are at stake.
He's rewritten the words, I think, which is a slight improvement.
Okay, I think there were two questions there, wasn't there? One was about how closely it's linked to the book and policy. Okay, so first of all, how closely is it linked to the book? Fairly closely. The book is the inspiration for the film. I've been working with the authors Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett very closely over both development of the film and its filming process. As yet, undecided as to whether they'll be in the film. There was always that intention, but it's, as we're piecing it together, then we're sort of trying to sort of work out what the role might be. How closely is it linked to the book? It is, in essence, telling the story that the book tells us. It's telling it in a different way and for a slightly different audience, which has always been the challenge, because, as I'm sure many of you know, the book is very, very heavily geared towards the statistical relationships between inequality and various social outcomes, and then goes on to try and sort of posit various theories as to why the relationship might work as one way rather than the other. So, although it can't show causation, obviously it's trying to work out how that relationship might have the outcomes that it's showing in the statistics. What we felt the film could do, because I actually don't agree with you that everybody knows that all these people have got bad lives and it's all down to inequality. I think that's not, I think in this room we might all know that, but we're not exactly ordinary people in this room. We're all people that are interested in this subject, have probably read a lot about this subject and understand this subject a lot more deeply than your average person. I think your average person might be sort of tangentially aware that, there's a lot of rising stress and a lot of health problems, and that actually we're quite rich, so why are there all these issues? But I don't think actually your average person has yet made the leap between what the spirit level shows, which is that a rising gap between rich and poor is actually a driver for a lot of these social problems. So although, yes, we're showing people in various different income situations across the world, and yes, they have differing challenges in their lives, I think the film is aiming both to show that relationship, as the book does show the relationship between the economic situation and the social outcome, the sense of otherness, the stress, the status, and how that impacts on health and various other outcomes. What it can do that the book couldn't do, of course, was to take us into the psychology of that and take us into sort of understanding how that causal mechanism might work one way rather than work another way, which, of course, where there's a lot of contention amongst critics of the book. And I think it's quite powerful when we're sort of talking about reasons why certain outcomes might happen, that we can clearly get people to sort of engage with and empathise and see the sort of way these behavioural outcomes do come to be. Where it does slightly go beyond the book in some ways is that there's a level of the story that's piecing it together with the changes in the economy, not just purely looking at the relationships. We're looking at what changes have happened in the developed world economies that have led to this rising income gap. Be this, financialization of the economy, the rise of the corporate sector, the political influence, the decline of power of workers, various different things that have both been the engine of that change and, of course, entrenched some of the changes that have happened. And the final part of your question was policy. Now, I'm not a politician and I'm not a policy maker, and I don't ever claim to be. I'm making a film about the spirit level, which doesn't actually pose any policy outcomes in the book. Obviously, because we're looking at some of the engines and drivers of this rising inequality, this does lead to various different questions about taxation policy or looking at minimum fair living wages. And I think there will be things that will be addressed within the film, but whether the film has any sort of concrete policy options is actually something we're debating very heavily, because engaging people in a topic and then appearing to put forward a piece of propaganda for a certain political agenda are two very different things, and it's a very fine line when we're sort of talking about getting people engaged in this issue, not to be too overtly kind of prescriptive and top down when we're trying to get people to. Well, my view is that I'd like people to have a conversation about what they want to do to move forward rather than put forward my own ideas.
Thank you. Any more questions? Should we start that way and go this way? So one up there, and then a woman there, and then the gentleman down here.
Yeah, this question's for Jason. I just wonder the narrative of that charities are kind of perpetuating a bit of a cycle, and that it's a bit of a band-aid solution, I guess, that we could say. So economic policies are usually looking into the future. They will take a long time to implement and have possibly a long time to have effects on people in the countries where people actually need treatment for malaria or need treatment for HIV. Do you have any ideas about other models that would be better than what the charitable solution is currently? Because there is a lot of criticism for it, but I haven't really heard anyone who has any sort of innovative or what do we do instead? Because there is that moral imperative that we can't really forget about those people that do need that malaria treatment, that are in these possibly corrupt governments, that it doesn't trickle down. And we also see in the spirit level that it doesn't trickle down in the UK either. So it's quite I would say, a dilemma.
You go next, then we can have you go.
Hi, I'm Dr. Charmian Gold, I'm a retired GP. I work now assessing asylum seekers who have been tortured. I write medico-legal reports. But really that's not what I'm going to tell you about. It's just my husband is a filmmaker too. And he's travelled quite a bit, made films about Tsetse Flower and Bill Hartzer and so on. And I just wonder how you're going to distribute this. How are you going to distribute your film, really? That's all.
Thanks. There was a woman up there. There we go.
Thanks. First of all, thank you for two really inspiring talks. I'm Sam, a doctor from the UK. I've been working for the Western Cape Department of Health. And once I was out there, got involved in a project looking to make a documentary with a UK film production company on child gangsterism as a kind of symptom of the inequality out there. And my question was for both of you about any obstacles that you'd come across. Obviously, you're exposing some quite high-profile companies. I know that you had the name of one of the banks, and obviously quite a high member from that bank talking on your film. Was kind of any rules that guide that process, and did you get into any trouble along the way?
We'll talk about
Thank you. And down here.
Hello, William House. It's probably more of a comment really, but which you may want to comment back. And it's about this charity thing. We're in the process of setting up a charity, so I've been reading a lot of the UK Charity Commission website, which is quite an interesting experience. And actually, the Charity Commission rules make it quite difficult to do charitable sort of work with people who are not normally the recipients of charity. And we've been talking quite a lot about ordinary people who wouldn't normally be objects of charity who are actually suffering. I think we've come up with a formula for writing the charitable objectives in such a way to get round that. But we haven't actually submitted it to the Charity Commission yet. But I think with imagination, it's possible to get round it, because in effect, the situation in the country is such that everybody is suffering now. So anyway, that's a comment you might like to reply on.
Great, thank you. We've got a sort of twin track going on, haven't we? The mechanisms of filmmaking and the intricacies of inequality, which is great. I mean, they're the two topics of this whole thing. So should we do them in the order they came up? Start with Jason, and then we still need charity.
Sure. I guess the best way to respond to that is to start by talking a bit about Bono again. So sort of in response to the last question. So what's interesting is that the powers that be, so to speak, are very happy to welcome people like Bono into the spotlight, right? Because the solutions they offer do not pose any fundamental challenge to the present distribution of wealth and power in the world, right? Which is why presidents and prime ministers are very happy to get to know Bono. In fact, he serves their interests because he allows for kind of this escape valve, this release valve of the pressure that we have about the problem of poverty into a very non-threatening space, okay? But groups like the People's Health Movement, for example, which actually have a political critique of poverty and the problems of public health, they will never get that kind of spotlight, right? And it's not just because they don't have fancy genes, it's because they challenge existing power relations, right? So that's it's something to keep in mind as you think about whose voice is elevated in this space and whose is not. As far as the solution goes, the policy solutions are pretty obvious. You need to democratize global governance immediately. This has been a demand by global south countries for a very, very long time, but we pay very little attention to that. You need immediate debt cancellation in almost all cases. The Jubilee campaign has been working on this really hard. You need cessation of tax evasion. Okay, because of people's political movements here in Europe, we're actually working towards this kind of solution, right? And so it's conceivable that we'll have something in place in the relatively near future if we keep the pressure up. But the point here is that what you need is not a quick fix, but rather you need political movements, grassroots political movements, and we need to be involved in that kind of thing. And also keep in mind that those movements already exist, right? These IMF riots that have been spreading across the global south for the past 30 years, that this is the kind of thing we need to highlight and tap into and build expressions upon. There is, of course, in the meantime, I think a place for something like aid, but it should be stripped of this framing of charity and considered rather a kind of dues, right? And so to the extent that we can give money to help, say, Ebola efforts, this should not be seen as a kind of charity. Okay? It should be seen as a fundamental human right. And I think that framing transformation is really essential to this discussion.
Thank you. Katharine, would you like to take the ones on the spirit level, how we distribute it, and obstacles to filming?
Okay. Distribution question first. That's actually slightly easier. This film is kind of in a way following in the footsteps of various other films that have followed a similar distribution model. I'm working with an executive producer called Christopher Hurd, who runs a company called Dartmouth Films, and the model that they've used in the past and that we're using for this film is basically got 3 phases to it. And this was done on, other films like End of the Line, Fire in the Blood, which I know you may have heard of. Basically, there'll be a theatrical premiere, which the idea of this being that we will fill seats in cinemas around the country and get a lot of publicity for the film. If it's in cinemas, you get a huge amount of publicity in the press. So that's the first protocol. So there'll be the theatrical premiere and festival release. Secondly, and this will happen, I mean, we've already sold our premieres around the world, in Australia and places like that. So it's quite exciting, actually, how much interest we've had. Secondly, there is the sort of what we call outreach screenings, which are actually kind of the bulk, really, of the sort of grassroots work. And this is where people like yourselves come in, because this is organising screenings in local cinemas, in community groups, church halls, lots of different places where we can really sort of work with you to get the message of the film out. And this will be sort of something that will roll out actually after the initial release of the film and the cinema release is finished. And then beyond that, we're talking to broadcasters, of course, about television release or acquisition. And again, we'll start in the UK and the US, but there's actually quite a global interest in this film, certainly from Australia and New Zealand, who I believe have quite a lot of rising inequality in their countries. So that's the quick overview of our distribution plan.
Great. Second question. Obstacles.
Yeah, obstacles. Oh God. So yeah, there's lots of obstacles. And your film's about what was that? Did you say? Child gangsters. Interestingly, I actually do have a character who fits that profile in the Spirit level, who I haven't shown you. That in itself, I mean, has lots of ethical and issues around it, of course, when you're talking about people who are vulnerable and criminal behaviour. Actually had to work quite closely with a number of community groups to kind of find the right person for the film, just from a kind of, to make the tone right, really, and also to make sure that we were able to convey and give a voice rather than be seen to be sort of glamorising or kind of exploiting fairly vulnerable young people. But I think your question was more about corporations, am I right? Yeah, no one wants to talk. I mean, this is the problem that we had when trying to sort of kind of blow the lid, really, on what had been going on Wall Street, and certainly what's going on in some of the big corporations was, every single Wall Street bank basically makes their employees sign a non-disclosure form, which means that if they talk to the media, then they can get sacked. And so finding a character that could speak to what was going on there was incredibly difficult. And certainly the two people that speak, which are Alexis Goldstein and Cathy O'Neill, who both worked for high-profile Wall Street banks. I mean, Alexis, I think, is identified as working for as former VP at Deutsche Bank. She also worked for Morgan Stanley. She doesn't work there anymore. So that's the only reason she could speak out. She's got no interest in going back. And that was her decision to do that. And she's quite a high-profile critic of Wall Street now. Both Alexis and Cathy do a lot of work with Occupy Wall Street, and they talk from within. And I think their experiences and testimony are really, really powerful for that. The main problem, actually, that we had was one of the characters that you haven't seen, who is a care worker on a 0 hours contract in this country. Her employer tried to, I don't know what technically they did. They basically tried to sue us in whatever way, whatever the legal mechanism is for that. But, it's ongoing, actually. And the issue is less with her employer, who actually did end up sacking her, which is not great, than the care industry as a whole, and that was always the thing. But again, it was trying to find people who could speak to in-work issues was incredibly difficult, because the power that these corporations have over their workers is such that people are terrified of losing their jobs. And I would go around and I'd speak to workers all over this country, and I'd hear the same thing over and over again, and it was almost impossible to get people to speak out. And I was, meeting Rochelle, who was the care worker, she's such a fighter. She'd just come out publicly before we started filming with her for the Spirit level, and she was like, I don't really care, they can sack me, I don't really, she's just like, I'm not prepared to let it continue. And I think it's her bravery and the bravery of people like that that will help us get this message out. So I hope that answers your question, but I don't know.
Great. Thank you. I think unless anyone's got any burning questions, we should probably finish there. I think the next session is in here, and you might want to pop to the loo first. So I've got three things to finish with. Then I guess one is don't forget to go and pre-buy the Spirit Level film on the website. The second is if you are interested in the Medact kind of idea of doing a short film on Ebola, and if Jason's story of doing it in 2 weeks with 800 quid has inspired you, then maybe I will we'll put a bit of paper here, and you can come down and write your email address or get in touch with Vic afterwards, and hopefully something like this with 500,000 YouTube views will appear soon. And finally, just to say thank you to our speakers again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm sorry we didn't see the other. I just felt like
it was the first one, a black girl, yeah, the first one they did.
To be honest,
and the line was about overreaching. As far as the first piece, that's when I listened to your presentation, I was like,
I didn't get that, sorry. I didn't know they had one. No way. That sounds really perfect. Okay, well, I should definitely take your email address down if you pop it. I haven't seen the public stuff.
Well, it's not a public house, but there's at the last conference they had a
I missed it. So they might be interested.
So I think it's really a good idea to
Alright, well if I take...
need to retrieve their email address and pass them to
Okay. Yeah, I've got to get the slides ready for the next thing, but that's fine. That sounds great. That sounds perfect, actually. That sounds like what we've been looking for. Yes, please. Back there.
Katie just got back. I think she had a slight sort of tense, so not it doesn't seem as alien as I
on you doing anything unless it's got their corporate agenda.
Quite well. I think it was one of the MSF places where they sat up quite quickly and the number of cases were dropping quite fast.
That's what I'm looking at. I was about...
He's back, he's about to go.
Judith, you're all in got out of this room. I know Victor. I need to put the location of the thingy on.
It's probably in London, like the hospital trust. Various other people have this little project now in Sierra Leone for 8 years.
So that's down there. Your presentation. And then there's a film, I don't know who's showing this film, what film is just shown.
Yes, I did.
When they sit down, when they sit there again. I am. You're from South Africa, aren't you? That's it.
I'm actually going to be in touch with you. I think my email was logged in on this. So I just don't want to leave myself. That is probably not there. It's alright. Sorry, what do you have?
Well, there's I've never met him.
He's around. USB.
I'm not really going to work very much. I might do a little bit of advice on it, but yeah, I guess data. Did you put your name down on the list? Ah. Hey, how's it going?
Thanks. Oh, good. Did you get yours?
It's a registered charity. Although we're doing policy because we want to have more global software. And they started off doing kind of like policy decision drives with Medact instead of focusing on trying to draw the discourse about poverty in a different direction, away from like the idea of development and aid towards more radical approach. So that's kind of our deal right now. So we're working on new videos that people can share around, and we have write on it's more of like you guys know adbusters now? So you put ideas out there and see if they can take them up. So that's kind of what we're working on. Just kind of have a different perspective out there.
I was just wondering if the sound I just tried it and I think it was very, very low.
Yeah, it's just something else. And I think that's because it's people is there.
Okay.
Okay,
so we've got a choir.
It should be. So we have to I can just run it down here and you can give up the switch. Yeah, good luck.
That it was them that did it. Yeah, the idea was that they did it. Yeah, we'll keep that. Alright, thanks. Well, finished filming that basically all the people that did it own this country.
Oh, not purity. No. Scotland and Wales are the same coloring. It's kind of amateur. And they didn't release it, you know. Probably in August, and I'm looking for them in August. I'm sorry, where are they? They came out like 4th of September. He was probably helping them. He said that he'd been these are not working. You must have done something different.
No, the other ones that are up there.
Yes, those are okay. This is probably something you do. There should be common across all the statistics, not just one line in the statistic that deals in England and Wales. Yes.
Seems like that's September and I'm like 3 years old. Yeah, good. Usual. Usually there's enough to get through the first 3 months. Got some research. And they're nice. Which is cool. So that one's kind of nice. It was great. It was so intense about the program. It's just so less than they arrive right on the play. So and it's a fun program, but it's it's not really like we're not getting another 3 coming over and where? We discussed it today. And then actually we see it just turns out because some of these two
Are you going to use some slides?
I did wonder about it, but I thought, no, I'm not very good with slides.
Yeah. Okay. And then do you think we should give a few minutes? No, I'm going to make sure we're going to round up more people. Oh, we have a bigger audience than this. Yeah. I think it's not bad. Yeah. I think there are a few people. Well, it's just acceptable. So as long as there's a few more, yeah. Very nice, brilliant, it's great. Very passionate. Yeah, it was really. Who filmed it? It was the Central European University, actually. They did a series of it. And they actually had a couple of films before, but they were. Wasn't Peter came in? It's because it looked like a Peter style film. I don't know. But yeah, they apparently it was like a really last minute thing. She was, I talked to her like the day she was flying home. She's like, let's see if I can grab someone right now. So, but yeah, no, I met her the day after. She was doing porn. Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, there's a really good piece. Yeah. Peter Soares. Did you enjoy the course? I did. Yeah. It's a really nice bunch of guys on it. Absolutely. Yeah. Both the sort of the instructors and the students. It was really interesting. Yeah, no, I enjoyed myself thoroughly. Were you there for the whole time, or did you not see? No, I came for, I read Damon's day, but I didn't get to see it. And I did my day. And then Cassie and I did. Yeah, I was there from 4 or 5 days. But nearly, yeah. So like books. Yeah. So it's fine. Yeah, no, it's really good. Just let these guys sit down.
Just like telling people where the post-conference social is. If they don't keep hydrated, they get angry.
Well, we're slightly yeah. Originally, I think they were going to be about 5:30, but it sounds like we got a little there's loads of discussions. Okay. Cut slides. It was about 16, 17 minutes, so I hate people going over from my time here. I think it's unless it's an impossible chance to be 17 like I did. That's the thing, because we also kind of went through the class and we sort of got the last week specifically. We've got the video for it. I do that each year, and you're the superintendent at the time. So I was really sorry about the because I hate doing it.
No, I don't know. But it was fun. It was the first presentation I've actually worked on in a while. Most of the stuff I've been taught right for, yeah, I have a long version of it, and I have a short version of it, I have a long version of it, the short version. Yeah, so that's kind of like to focus on. I thought, considering the audience, that I could kind of actually I actually said
It's mostly the Medact and my colleague Jess, who's on the yeah, she and Vic just go and but then we've got like so we've got it's really interesting stuff, actually. Thomas he was just moving outside and she was really interested because he was talking to her about it. And she's really interested. I'm chairing Katharine. We met briefly. Yeah, it was ages ago.
On the Eastwood Street.
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm just going to do a very quick introduction. Sure.
Is that okay?
How do you, is it Lucy? How do you tell?
Just say the details on the screen.
Okay. Can do that. It's actually queued up on QuickTime,
Yeah, unfortunately, I haven't. All day this has been a bit of a problem.
Okay.
And I think. No, I don't know. once people have got lower their volume, it's not too bad.
Okay. Yeah, I'll even tell them, it's a bit quiet, please get the sounds if you can.
Yeah, I think it's annoying, but I can't see a volume control.
Yeah, everything I can see is turned all the way up.
I don't know, I don't want to break it.
I know the feeling.
I think we're going to have to just ask people to be, but don't worry, I mean, you don't even have to ask them. It's not like, it's been quiet until people start, it's very echoey.
Yeah.
Cool. I will leave you to it. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, I think we're ready to get started here. Hello, everyone. My name is Katharine Martin. I'm with Health Poverty Action, and I've just been asked before we begin to draw your attention to the screen with the details of the post-forum social on it. So that's at 6 o'clock. So basically, I'm just going to be introducing our speakers today, but you may be wondering why we chose to have a session on the war on drugs and the failures of drug policy. And the reason is basically that even though this is an issue that intersects with health and development in a huge number of ways, it's not one that's discussed very often. So we wanted to change that and try to open up the dialogue a bit. I think I'm just going to plunge straight in and introduce our first speaker. Niamh Eastwood is the Executive Director of RELEASE, which is an international center of expertise on drug policy. And she's going to be talking about the Foundation's the War on Drugs, Failures and Alternatives.
Okay. Can you all hear me okay? Well done for making it to 4:15. Impressive. First of all, thank you very much to Medact and to HPA for the invitation to speak today. I work for RELEASE. As Katharine mentioned, we are the National Centre of Expertise in the UK on drugs and drug law. What we do is we provide services directly to people who use drugs, both recreational users and problematic users, around the criminal law and around social issues that drive inequality, including health inequalities. So the benefit cuts. We have been very much involved in making sure that our clients are represented at tribunals when they have been thrown off benefits, generally because of poor work capability assessments. As well as that, we campaign for reform of drug laws. And what I wanted to do for the first time in a very long time, rather than spiel out what I want to say, I thought I'd actually address what the panel title is, which is The War on Drugs, Failures, Impact and Alternatives. I won't have time to get into the future of public health, and I will leave that to the doctor on the panel, Dr. Yates. But I thought it'd be, interesting for us to look at really, is our drug policy working? So let's start at what the principal aim of our drug policy is. Well, the principal aim of our drug policy is to eliminate the use of all illicit substances. And that's both at a national level and at an international level. So to put it into context for you, the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs is the first UN treaty, the first international UN treaty to deal with the illicit trade and use of drugs. And the preamble to that treaty states that member states who have signed up to it, and it has a very high compliance rate, are concerned with the health and welfare of mankind. The member states recognise that addiction to narcotic drugs constitutes a serious evil for the individual and is fraught with social and economic danger to mankind. And it is the duty of member states to combat this evil. I think it's interesting if you think about the language around that. It's very much steeped in issues of morality. There's a religious theme running through it. And when we look at other international conventions, none of them use the word evil. Not even the Convention Against Genocide. And I would say genocide's pretty bloody evil. Drug use, maybe less so. And there is a common acceptance by member states, by many member states, not all member states of the UN, that the way to deal with illicit drug use is to use criminal sanctions as a deterrent effect. So the vast majority of states who are signed up to the treaties have adopted the principle of those treaties within their national laws, and they pursue a criminal justice response in order to eliminate the use of all illicit substances. So clearly, if there is a risk of criminal penalties, people will not use drugs. Well, there are many graphs that I could have used, but I thought the problematic heroin use would probably be the most relevant, possibly for those who are working in the medical profession. And there we have, in 1971, the introduction of the Misuse of Drugs Act, which incorporated many of the requirements of the 1961 treaty, including the requirement to criminalise those who use illicit substances. This is the register of addicts. I don't like to use that word. I'm only using it because that's what it's officially called. We like to say problematic drug use because the term addict is highly stigmatising. And what we see is, despite the fact that you could be criminalised for your drug use or for your heroin use, the numbers increased exponentially. Interestingly, in 1985, there was an amendment to the 1971 Act that introduced life penalty for the supply of Class A substances. That didn't seem to have much of a deterrent effect either. But surely, I just want to reiterate this penalty sort of paradigm, the tougher we get, the more likely drug use will fall. This kind of shows the inverse. So here we have the period when cannabis was downgraded to Class C. You will all remember, or some of, actually I'm looking at the audience, you won't all remember. I remember, many of you will remember, the debacle that occurred when cannabis was downgraded to a Class C substance. David Blunkett was the Home Secretary at the time. And the right-wing press came out, Labour soft on drugs, our children will start using cannabis, numbers will increase, we have decriminalised cannabis use, we had not. And this was during a period when cannabis consumption was falling, especially amongst young people. So that decline continued despite the fact that penalties had reduced. In 2009, at the behest of the Daily Mail, Gordon Brown decided to reclassify it back up to B, and it continued to drop. The point is, the penalty, the legal framework, has no impact on levels of use. It does not act as a deterrent effect. But we must be pretty good at getting the supply side sorted. So, if we can't reduce demand, can't we at least reduce supply? And this is a slide that came out last week from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. And I just want to reiterate that. The UN Office on Drugs and Crime. So straight away, we're dealing with, at a UN level, at a human rights organization framework, a multilateral human rights framework, we have drugs defined within a crime paradigm. It's not the UN Office on Drugs and Health. So this came out last week. Opium cultivation in Afghanistan. 2014 was a record-breaking year. And the last 10 years, while the British and the US forces have been in Afghanistan, we have not managed to reduce cultivation, despite that being one of the objectives of the British forces. And in fact, cultivation has consistently been higher than it was under the Taliban. So we're not very good at curbing supply either, in a country where we have forces on the ground. But our drug policy is working. Drug use is falling. That's what the Home Office tells us. That's what David Cameron tells us. And to some degree, they're right. Since the year 2000, we've seen a reduction in the level of drug consumption, primarily, or probably only driven by a reduction in cannabis consumption. So it's fallen from about 30% of 16 to 24-year-olds reporting cannabis consumption in the 2000s to just below 20% in the most recent British crime survey. Interestingly, Class A drug use has stayed stable. We have small increases, decreases. Doesn't really mean much. But it's working because of that cannabis consumption, because it's falling. That's why it's working. And this came out, I mean, the most recent comment by the Prime Minister on this was on the 30th of October, when many of you will have seen the news. There was a Home Office report which looked at 11 other countries and their drug policies. Some of them had harsher policies, like Japan and Sweden. Some had more, I would say, pragmatic, health-based policies, like the Netherlands and Portugal. And the report was interesting to read. The analysis of the international comparators is good. But it refused to make recommendations because our politicians are very afraid of that. It was largely driven by the Liberal Democrats, who are committed to drug policy reform. But what it did say, one thing that we could take out of it, was that the report clearly said tough sanctions does not impact on rates of prevalence. That's what it said. It was very clear in that. We could at least take that from it. And our Prime Minister says drug policy is working. And this is in a year when we have increases in drug-related deaths. So the ONS reports on drug-related deaths that came out in September showed that there was a 21% increase in drug-related deaths. And specifically with heroin and morphine, that increase is 32%. So there's a 32% rise in 1 year. Now, there are many reasons for that, and I'm not suggesting for a second that the legal framework impacts on that. But when devising your drug policy, you have to ask what is more important. Is it drug use falling or drug-related deaths? And frankly, I would be perfectly happy with a small increase in non-problematic use of drugs if that meant we had a significant decrease in the number of people dying. So, what's more important? So in terms of the talk, failures, impact, alternatives, I would say it's a big fat fail. We haven't achieved the goal. The goal is the elimination of all illicit drug use. That has not happened, and even the reductions, depending on when you measure it from, have been pretty slight in Western countries, and in countries where we have transit routes and producer production, we've seen massive increases in consumption. So we're not doing well on the main aim of the policy. What's the impact? So I want to look just briefly at the national impact for the UK, because I think often what we do is we look at the impact internationally and we don't think about how drug laws affect our own citizens. So every year what we do is we criminalise 70 to 80,000 people, either through prosecuting them at court or through cautions at the police station. And there's this notion that the UK has a laissez-faire approach, that we're kind of a bit soft on drugs, when in fact, if you look at the statistics, what we've seen year on year is a steady increase in the levels of prosecutions, at least for the last 5 years. And that is primarily driven by cannabis, with cannabis accounting for over 50% of prosecutions. Also, like in the US, and this is research that's come out of work that we've done at Release with the London School of Economics, the report is on our website, but like in the US, our drug laws unduly fall on the Black and Asian community, with Black people being 6 times more likely to be stopped and searched for drugs, Asian people twice as likely, and that's despite the fact that drug use is much lower amongst both the Asian and Black population compared to the white population. And even in our research, we looked at what was happening to people within the criminal justice system, who was getting the harsh sanctions. And what we found was Black people were getting a higher rate of sanctioning than white people. So they were more likely to be sent to court for a possession offence than white people. They were more likely to be dealt with through cautions at the police station, which is a less intrusive approach, albeit a criminal justice response. I think we have to talk about the damage a criminal record does. You know, at the end of the day, and it's primarily our young people who make up that number of 70 to 80,000, what we're doing is we're giving them a criminal record, which impacts on their employment opportunities, it impacts on their educational aspirations, And it impacts on things that others will take for granted, like traveling. There are some countries that you cannot enter because you have a criminal record for drugs. In the US, if you have been arrested for a drugs offence, you do not get to benefit from the visa waiver scheme. And most importantly, it carries with it a huge amount of stigma. So like, I think there's two groups that are stigmatized within drug policy or as a result of our drug laws, those who are criminalized and problematic drug users. And that sense of the other that we talked about in the last session around the spirit level is very much applied to people who are affected by the drug laws and those who use problematically. So it's really damaging. And then the international impact. So that was very brief. I mean, there's lots of national impacts. So, I could have gone on for 20 minutes on this, but I want to kind of take it to the macro picture where it really is a complete and utter mess. So in terms of the international impact of prohibition, in 2008, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime actually put out a report for the first time. So this was, 47 years after the first UN treaty on drugs. And what it said for the first time was that, yes, there were unintended consequences that resulted from a policy of prohibition. There are questions whether these are unintended or intended, but just to go through what the UN said. So they said that the financial incentives are enormous. Prohibition has created a market that's worth 320 billion. That was a 2003 UN estimate, to anywhere around 500 billion. We don't know the size of the market. That's what happens when you make things illegal. And what this does is it undermines security. So, there's a tragic example of that at the moment in Mexico. So you're all aware of the 43 students who were murdered about a month ago as a result of protests. And it looks like the police and the politicians are or have collaborated with the local drug cartels around the execution of these students. That's an example of how security has been undermined. So, political and law enforcement institutions undermined by the drugs trade. We've seen it in West Africa, where, and I'll get back to this in a moment, but in West Africa, where the transit route has moved to that region, we see countries such as Guinea-Bissau, where it's estimated that the drug trade is actually worth 2-3 times what GDP is in that country. I think HPA probably know a lot more about that than I do. But it undermines security. It fuels violence. Back to Mexico. It's estimated that since 2006, when the president of Mexico really took a military response to the drugs trade, really sort of bore down using the military, that over 100,000 people have died as a result of drugs violence in that country. And a further 25,000 have been disappeared. I mean, that's just in a 8-year period. 100,000 people died, and nobody's talking about, well, that's not fair. People are talking about reviewing the policy. But that is directly as a result of prohibition. The UN also recognised that there's policy displacement, where as a result of this focus on law enforcement, the resources are given to law enforcement rather than to public health. And that's led to a HIV epidemic amongst people who inject drugs in some parts of the world, where we see in Russia 1 in 100 adults are HIV positive, much of that driven by injecting drug use, which is linked to a repressive drug law regime where there is no public health response. It's estimated that 30% of all HIV positive cases outside of sub-Saharan Africa are as a result of injecting drug use. And that doesn't have to be the case. We know in Britain, we're actually very good at harm reduction in Britain. So we know that that doesn't have to be a case, but this policy displacement has contributed to that. I'd also like to note hepatitis C in the UK, where we have 50 to 60% of people who inject drugs are hepatitis C positive. Yet 3% are in treatment. 3% of a disease that can kill you and that we have a cure for. 3%. If that was cancer, there would be outrage, absolute outrage. And in the UK, what we do is we spend twice as much on law enforcement, 1.5 billion, compared to the 800 million we spend on treatment. So that's a choice that we make. There's a geographical, another thing the UN identified, a geographical displacement of the trade. So in Colombia, they were successful at reducing both, or repressing both production and transit through the Caribbean route from Colombia. And what happens? Well, production shifts to Peru, so Peru makes up the loss that Colombia was producing around the coca. And the trade shifts to Mexico. And so what we saw then is this huge amount of violence in Mexico. And now it's shifted to Belize, as certain parts of Mexican law enforcement has been effective. And in Belize, we now have the highest homicide rate in the world, I think was the last estimate. And West Africa, as I said, has been another area that we've pushed the trade towards. It's called the balloon effect. So essentially, when you push down in one area, you push it to another. You're not going to get rid of this trade. There's a demand, there is supply. Impact, I'm conscious of time, so I'm not going to go into the environment argument, but it does impact negatively on the environment. The UN also identified substance displacement. So where you are effective, essentially, at maybe disrupting one drug, you shift people to another. Methadone in the UK is an excellent example of that. What happened was purity rates of ecstasy and cocaine dropped. Ecstasy dropped significantly because of successful interdiction on the precursors. People didn't like bad drugs because drug users are, discerning like everybody else. They like their drugs to be good drugs. And so they discovered methadone, which was really nice. It got them high. It was a decent drug. But we don't know anything about methadone, or we didn't back then. And arguably we have decades of research around ecstasy. We know the harms of it. We know how to do harm reduction around it. And by repressing that drug, we shift people to a drug we don't know much about. In Russia, similar things happened. The repression of the trade around heroin has led to people using crocodile, which is a horrific drug. It's a synthetic opiate. It causes huge harms, huge harms. And then they finally said, we also recognize that the policy results in the marginalization of people who use drugs. And I think that speaks very much to the idea of the other. Around the world, we see human rights abuses, where we have forced treatment centres in Southeast Asia where people are tortured, who are deemed, it's acceptable to have their rights taken away because the drugs need to be dealt with. That takes priority over everything else. And even in the UK, the idea that we have drug treatment through our criminal justice system, what is drug treatment doing in the criminal justice system? Why, as a basis, is it there? That's because people commit crimes, because drugs are expensive, because they're prohibited. But anyway, I think Judith's going to mention access to essential medicine, so I'm not going to talk about that. And then there are alternatives, the final point of my talk. This is a really good report that was just released by the Global Commission on Drug Policy, who are a group of very high-profile individuals, presidents from Latin America, a couple of presidents from Europe, Kofi Annan, Richard Branson's on there. And basically what it does is it calls for the decriminalisation of drug possession offences, and for us to start as governments, or for governments to start to look at regulatory models for drugs. So this is what we advocate for at Release. This is our first starting point. We say end criminal sanctions for drug possession offences immediately for all drugs. There is no need to criminalise people who use drugs. It's worth noting that that point of marginalisation is the stigma around drug use means that seeking help is really difficult. So from a public health perspective, criminalisation is undermining the effectiveness of health approaches. And I think this is really well demonstrated by the Portuguese model. So Portugal decriminalised all drugs in 2001. I just want to be clear, decriminalisation is the end of criminal sanctions for drug possession. It is not regulation or legalisation. People conflate this, and the media is a nightmare on it. People conflate it all the time. So it's a completely different thing. So Portugal introduced this in 2001, as well as investing heavily in public health responses. They go together. These are not separate policies. And what they've found since 2001 is that there's been a decrease in use amongst vulnerable groups, including problematic users and young people, a reduction in the number of young people moving on to more problematic drugs such as heroin. They estimated that there was a decrease of 40% in injecting drug use, increases of people going into treatment, and I would say that's both the investment in the treatment but also the reduction of the stigma and the fear of police officers seeing you go into treatment centres. You know, when you access a treatment centre, you're identifying yourself as a drug user, you're identifying yourself as someone who has committed a crime. And also too that there was a significant number in the reduction, or in a reduction in drug-related deaths. Most interesting for me around the racial disparity work that we've done. I mean, obviously drug laws are a really easy way of policing large numbers of the community, and that can, you know, it drives our stop and search in this country. 60% of stop and searches are for drugs, and that's all low-level street possession, cannabis, and it's really focused on areas of deprivation, and it's a way of harassing kids really in the area. That's what it is, and the police hope that they pick up these kids with cannabis because it's easy to detect and it's good for their numbers. It's that kind of thing. And in Portugal, when they were introducing this policy, the police were really against it. They thought they would lose the ability to have informants, given this idea that people who use drugs would tell them, you know, about the supply chain, because obviously they knew about that. You know, when they buy their heroin, they say, well, where did that all come from and who's involved? Anyway, they actually, 10 years on, they find that the relationship between the community and the police have improved immensely. So the community now, because the police aren't going in and harassing them around low-level drug use, the community now come to them when there's a problem. So it's improved that relationship. Just to mention, some of this work, this research has mainly come from a guy called Alex Stevens at Kent University. If you are interested in drug policy, follow him on Twitter, he's very interesting. But we also used we did a synopsis of this in a report that we produced in 2012, which looked at 21 jurisdictions across the globe that had adopted some form of decriminalisation, either all drugs or just cannabis. The basic premise was to look at whether levels of drug use had increased in those countries, and it hadn't. You know, it just hadn't. It comes right back to my original point of prevalence isn't dictated by the law, the legal framework you have. But this was something we came across that hadn't been published before, which was from the Czech Republic. They actually carried out a cost-benefit analysis in 2002. It was the first time, it's the only time, a country has actually carried out a cost-benefit analysis, an impact assessment of whether their drug laws work or not. I mean, that just seems nuts. Nobody's actually looked at whether this works. And they were in, you know, again, a long conversation around this, but essentially a very unique position. They come out of the Soviet bloc. You know, they had adopted the very harsh response that Russia had put in place previously, criminalisation. So they had this opportunity to assess it. And so this was an assessment of the use of criminal laws. And on 3 markers, they found that the criminal justice approach had not affected the availability of drugs. Drugs were still available. That there had been an increase in the level of drug use within the country. Again, I wouldn't say that was a result of the criminal laws, just it doesn't matter. It doesn't impact, so why bother criminalising people? But the social costs of illicit drug use increased significantly. And in 2010, the Czech Republic decriminalised all possession of all drugs. So that's decrim. Regulation of drugs. We are now seeing probably a brave new world. Last week, 2 more states joined Colorado and Washington to regulate cannabis for recreational purposes, not medical use. So we have 4 states in the US that have now regulated cannabis and are in direct breach of those international conventions that I mentioned. We expect more states to come on board at the next election, not least California, and when California goes, it will be huge. At the same time, Uruguay has adopted a regulatory market for cannabis. And I think sometimes when we talk about regulation, legalization of drugs, we think about drugs as a homogenous group of substances, and they're not. You guys all know that. They're very different substances, and we would have different regulatory frameworks for it. I think ultimately, decriminalisation ends the harms that users face, but it doesn't deal with the supply side problems. And if we really honestly want to tackle supply side, we have to regulate. And I think there are lessons we can learn from what's happening in the States and Uruguay. We're already regulating things like heroin through, you know, heroin assisted treatment. There's trials in this country and in other countries. That's a form of regulation. So there are things that we can do to explore it, but we have to do it in a responsible way. So it has to be tightly controlled. We need to learn from tobacco. We need to learn from alcohol. but we need to change our drug policy. Thank you. And just to say, if you ever need any legal advice or expert drugs advice, clients, patients, anyone, that's our helpline. It's free. I've put the London number up because it's cheaper than 0845. And they ask, we respond within 24 hours.
All right, thank you very much, Neve, for that. Next, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Judith Yates.
How will I find my... Can you help me? I'll close that there, perhaps. I don't know. Am I closing that as well? No.
Dr. Yates is the the chair of the board of International Doctors for Healthier Drug Policy, and we're just finding a presentation.
Somewhere on the desktop.
Okay.
The desktop's got hidden. A bit like my desk.
There, that's you.
Yeah.
What's it going to do?
Oh gosh. What was it doing? Something awful. Where's the sorry, where's me? I'm used to Apple now. How do I play? How do I get to the slides? I've forgotten how to use ordinary. I've forgotten how to use ordinary computers. So hello, I'm a GP from Birmingham. Well, I was a GP in my surgery for 35 years. I'm also part of International Doctors for Health-Based Drug Policies, and what I need to show you my T-shirt because Chris Ford will be very cross if I don't. And I also need to, just before I start, I need to ask you to, we normally all of us work in multidisciplinary teams of all kinds of people, but we are actually trying to collect together medical doctors for the purpose of getting a good strong voice at the United Nations for the Special Assembly in 2016, when there will be a chance to look at these conventions and try and get health-based policies instead of crime-based policies. So we're trying to collect doctors, and you can all help me because we're on 796 doctors at the moment. So how many medical doctors are there in the room at the moment? Thank you. And how, keep your hands up. Put your hands down if you're already a member free of IDHDP. Look, so we can blast it. If you've got an iPhone, you have my permission now. You only have to put your email address in, and it's free. It takes about 5 seconds, and your speciality. And we would like people who don't necessarily specialise in drug treatment as I have done, but all kinds of different doctors to join us and be part of this. We have 74 different countries, and I think it's 74, 75, and as I say, almost 800 doctors so far, and we're aiming to have a good voice. Sorry, I don't even know what I'm doing here. How am I going to go forward with this? I go like that? Yes, here we are. So I've been a GP in Birmingham. We have our own wars in Birmingham. That's our bull, for 35 years. And for the last couple of years, when I retired from my GP practice, my NHS pension, which I'm lucky to have, allows me to look at drug policy a bit more, both locally in Birmingham, and to think about what I've been doing. Because when you're a GP, as some of you will know, you're a coal-faced worker, you're busy all the time, aren't you? The whole hours that there are, really. So when I stopped, I looked at it and I thought, this is mad. And some of what we've just heard now, I was reading about this and I thought, this is crazy. Something in the world has gone mad. And I looked at what we're doing in Birmingham and what we're doing in the country, and also a bit more this year. I went to the United Nations this year, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute, and learnt some more about what's happening around the world. In Birmingham, we are... Yes, we are at the forefront as well of getting rid of the NHS. We've had our drug and alcohol treatment services retendered just now this year, which means that from March this year we'll have no NHS provision of drug and alcohol treatment across Birmingham, which is interesting, isn't it? And the budget which we've been spending this year, £24 million to treat drug and alcohol services across Birmingham. And that was reduced by 6 million because the police took some out of it. So it was down to 18 million when they're retendered. And the new people who've won the tender have offered to do it for 14.5 million. from next year. So they will have a bit more in the first year, but I think that's just to pay for the redundancies that will be needed. And we're going to have a challenge to keep 5,000 people on drug treatment services safe on their scripts from March the 1st. They're all changing over to the new system, which is not a non-NHS based service. And the only reason I haven't fully retired yet is to see my patients safely transfer into this new world. So that's just an aside, really, of what's happening in the poor old NHS. And as we've just heard, the drug-related deaths were falling. You can see, I've been giving talks about them for 4 years. I was able to say we were doing well in Birmingham, everything was doing fine. This curve matches the curve that you saw earlier, the UK curve, and actually going further back, Birmingham almost always matches completely. We were looking forward in 2011 to going down further and saying, look how well we're doing, and how shocked we were in September this year to have the Office of National Statistics point out that our Birmingham deaths have doubled really since 2011. Look at that, up to 46, which is some of those were my patients, I'm afraid. And in the national picture of the 32% rise in deaths in heroin and morphine, but not in Scotland and not in Wales. And the Office of National Statistics in their report said maybe the cause of this, because the government asked them to say, what do you think might be causing this? Maybe you've counted it wrong. And they said, well, we haven't counted it wrong. Maybe the heroin levels of purity are wrong, or changed or something that year. But there was a question immediately in my mind. They didn't change in Scotland, where drug-related deaths went down that year. It's the same heroin. And in Wales, where the drug-related deaths stayed static that year, they avoided this rise. It's the same heroin. So something else is happening. Also, female drug-related deaths didn't go up in the same way. So it's something particularly to the male population. And we don't know, but it's something that we're certainly focusing on, we're very worried about. So I'm going to talk about the health consequences of the war on drugs, particularly starting from my own personal perspective, because I've been looking at this, as I say, in more detail over the last couple of years. Initially in what was happening in my surgery, one particular patient just before I retired, and then what's happening in Birmingham. I'll show you a little bit about why I think we could do with a drug consumption room in Birmingham. They have 88 around the world. We don't have one in the UK at all. And then just going to touch on Portugal again. Has the sky fallen in since they decriminalised? Apparently not. And then the United Nations shocking worldwide obstacles to access to pain relief at the end of it. So this is not quite my surgery. I'm just around the back of these canals in Birmingham. Just before I retired, one of the things which I thought about after I retired as being a sign that the world was mad and there weren't any grown-ups in the world. One of my patients, a nice 22-year-old lad, his uncle runs an MOT garage, and he'd been working with him, but he got into drugs and fell out with the family and ended up in a hostel with 3 of his mates, and the 4 of them were there living in this quite a small, well-organised hostel where they got them into the housing support, and my particular patient got a flat right by my surgery, but a week or so before they moved out of the hostel, were due to move out, a little chap from Glasgow moved into the hostel, and he was sort of shaking a bit, and he came in an old battered car, and he said, I need a bag, and does anybody, I don't know the D, I've just come down from Glasgow, I can't do a Glasgow accent, and I've got a £10 note, if you go and get a bag, I'll share it with you, I only need a few lines to straighten my head. So one of them went down to the dealer at the bookmakers opposite my surgery and got a bag, and they shared it. And then a couple of days later, another 2 of them did the same thing for him. And then a couple of days after that, my patient, he found him when he was on his own. He said, look, I've got a place in the clinic. I'm going to get me methadone next week, but I just need another bag just to keep me going over the weekend. And my patient sensibly said, well, I'm not going to get you a bag. You can get your own bag. I don't mind showing you where the dealer is. So he got in the car with this little Weasley policeman from Glasgow, and took him down to the bookmakers, and the policeman, Weasley chap from Glasgow, nothing against Glasgow or policemen, of course, was waving this £10 note and said, and we know about this because there's CCTV directly on this car at this point, and he said, go and you go and get it. I'm frightened. They don't know me in there. And my patient sensibly said, no, look, the door's open. He's on the left. You can see him through the door. Take your £10. You'll have no trouble. So he went in and bought it and came out. Anyway, the following week, all 4 of them were arrested, of course, and they were all arrested and and kept in overnight. The duty solicitor said to my patient, well, you didn't do anything, you just showed the policeman where the drug dealer was. So they let him out the next day on bail. The other 3 got sent down and were on remand for 3 months till it came to trial. And then when it came to trial, my patient, who was by then back in terms with his uncle and was doing well with his life, his case was dropped the day before because actually he'd done no wrong really. And the other 3, what had they done? They tried to help somebody, but they got, I think it was 6 months or something. But my patient pointed out they were all mates of his. They'd been doing well up to that point. They'd been on their line to get out of drugs. They'd all been on scripts. They'd been getting on the housing ladder. They were getting back on with their lives. And now, none of them had a criminal record before this point. They all had a criminal record for selling Class A drugs, And they only got a 6-month sentence, okay. And they were out, for, I think, the following week or something. Or I don't know, maybe it was in the same day. They weren't actually my patients. But I was just shocked, really, by this. They can recover from, obviously, their problem they'd had with drugs and with their lives at that point, but they'll never, ever recover from having a drug offence like that on their record. That's a life damage that the war on drugs has caused. And there they all were in HMP prison. So just moving on to, this is what happens to the needle and syringes that we hand out in Birmingham, some of them. We give out needle syringes, I'm sure you know, to people who use drugs to prevent bloodborne viruses. But we know we've been doing this for 25 years in Birmingham, and we know that some of them have nowhere safe or clean or hygienic to go to inject. And we come into Boots Pharmacy every day and we give them out every day, and we know they're going to the canals, or this is a rooftop about 100 yards from Harvey Nichols in the middle of Birmingham. And I went up, there's a photograph that I took in September because I went out with Drugline to collect needle litter. And I am just shocked. Sorry. What am I doing wrong?
No, you got it.
No.
I just need to.
Why did it say 4 hours? I don't know. Does that mean I've spoken to? Oh, so I'm not going to leave this on for too long. But this is one of our street injectors at that time, and this is what happens when you have to inject outside in the cold. You haven't got a bright light to see what you're doing. You can't wash your hands before, and you can't wash your hands after. So this last year or so, I've been to visit some of these so-called drug consumption rooms in Europe. There's 88 around the world. They're cheap, they're simple. This one, the bottom left, is it? Yeah, for you. In Amsterdam, I was there a couple of weeks ago, and it's just that middle floor of that black house there, and the photograph in the middle. It's just four tables. There's no expense to it. There isn't even a doctor or a nurse there, but people can come in there. They wash their hands, they do their drugs, and then they put their stuff in the sharps bin, and they wash their hands again, and they go out, and they can go downstairs and have a cup of tea. There's no doctor, no nurse, just a drug worker in the room to call for help if there's any problems, which there hardly ever is. And this K-Nerf, this nice green place in Geneva, I went to visit that as well and had a look at that. It's a bit more clinical, Switzerland, but they're not the most kind of liberal country, are they, Switzerland? And yet K-Nerf has been open for 12 years, and the story I heard there was transformational for me. I spoke to this nurse there, and she said that she used to be an orthopaedic nurse, and she'd see all these leg ulcers, like that poor chap with his arms, and she used to have to dress them and do before this place opened. And she said, we don't see, and I told her we have that stuff, all those abscesses and drug DVTs and things in Birmingham still. And she said they've gone in Geneva. There's no street injecting, hardly any street injecting anymore. If anybody sees anybody injecting, they direct them to K-Nerf. It's just a sensible, pragmatic. We can't have this in the United Kingdom because of the war on drugs, apparently, although other countries in Europe and also Canada and Australia seem to have managed it. The top row is the one on the right. That's the needles I picked up myself. The one in the middle is it's about 50 yards from the Radisson Hotel, if anybody stayed there, a big posh green hotel in Birmingham. And then this Home Office report, Norman Baker and Crowd last week said they looked at drug consumption. They said there is some evidence for the effectiveness of drug consumption rooms in addressing, health risks for drug. Well, there is. There's bucket loads of evidence from all these places where they have them. And then it said we do not experience scenes of public drug taking on the same scale in this country. Well, he hasn't been to Birmingham. Our injecting drug users don't actually like to inject in the public in front of the gaze of children and their aunts and uncles and things. So they do go round the back, and they do go hide round the back of the bushes where they won't be seen. But we certainly got people who have got no safe place to inject, and I think it's crackers, bonkers. And coming to Portugal, then, has the sky fallen in? No, it hasn't. This is what happened. They decriminalised here in 2001, and this is what happened to their new cases of HIV. And this is just an example of the benefits of decriminalisation on the health and on the public purse as well, because of the financial implications of that. And this is the falling rates of drug use in Birmingham. This is I've stolen all Transform slides because we haven't got Transform here today. So, but they've got wonderful explanations there of the. Oh, this is me. You see, here we are. This is me in Vienna. I went. I'm part of this international doctors. This says Physicians Globally Unite or something for health-based drug. But anyway, as part of this, I went as part of the civil society to the United Nations in March. I was amazed, as you can see, to find myself there among all these people. That chap with the white hair in the middle at the back, he's the Greek ambassador, and he's just saying that the European countries would like the death penalty for drug use to be got rid of, really. But it was vetoed at the United Nations by Russia and China and Singapore and places who actually quite like to hang people for drug use. The war is crazy. And the oh, look what's happened. That's funny. I'm sorry, it's gone all upside down. Is it upside down? Yes, it is. Anyway, you can still see it's the world. And this is the International Narcotics Control Board, who are employed by all of us taxpayers around the world underneath the United Nations to police all of this. And they themselves are worried about the availability of narcotics drugs for medical use. I can assure you on my Apple this morning, that was the right way up. This is the problem, isn't it, with using different computers. And the red places and the dark green places have got sufficient, I think it's dark green, yeah, red and dark green, have got sufficient opiate painkillers for medicinal use. And to my absolute amazement in March, the purple places and the white places and the pale green places have got almost none. And the reason for that is not money, it's because for a country to receive any, and it's not even the law, there's no law against giving people painkillers for terminal care. It's because each country's got to do this, jump through all these hoops, and then there's helicopter gunships will come if you don't do this properly. If you've been giving people with terminal care, morphine, and you haven't counted it properly and you haven't ticked the boxes properly, then the America might come and kill everybody. I mean, it is, I'm sorry, it's absurd. And to be eligible, you have an annual quota, and the countries have to apply for this each year, and they haven't been doing it because they've got other things on their minds. And the low-income countries have shockingly inadequate levels. Sorry, I'll get this the wrong way around, won't I? But this is the amount of morphine. 92% of the world's morphine is the blue bit, which we use in America and Europe and Australia. And we use all of that, and that little red bit is what's left for the rest, the other 92% of the world's population. 80, yes, anyway, I got it wrong. 83. It's one of those things which I always get the wrong way around. So this is the International Narcotics Control Board, who are supposed to, one of the aims of that 1961, they were instructed to do this, to ensure adequate access for medical and scientific purposes, and they haven't managed to do it. They're all policemen, actually, and they're supposed to help countries to have access to medicines for health purposes, and they failed to do it. There is a call to get that job given to the WHO, and maybe they would make a better fist of it, but I think and there's the shocking. So is it time to end the war on drugs? Well, I would say, I think it is. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Judith. Next up, we actually have a video from one of our contributors who wasn't able to be here today. This is from Julia Buxton, who's a professor in the School of Public Policy at Central European University. Let me just pull this up. And she sent us a video talking about the impacts of drug policy on international development and global poverty. And I'm afraid the sound is a little quiet, so if you could stay as quiet as you can, it should be all right.
My name is Julia Buxton. I'm Professor of Comparative Politics in the School of Public Policy at the Central European University. And one of the issues which is really key, very, very important at the moment in terms of drug policy reform and drug policy debate are issues around the relationship between drugs and development. We have a hugely significant UN General Assembly special session in 2016 on drug policy, whether there is scope and manoeuvre for reform. And at the same time, in 2015, we have this process of elaborating the post-2015 Millennium Development Goals, looking at the agenda for the future. One of the key issues for the drug policy reform community currently is trying to deepen this relationship between the drugs community and the development community, and most specifically, that we engage the development community in understanding that drugs is a development issue and it needs to be recognised as such. The traditional model of controlling narcotic drugs has always pivoted around either law enforcement, which is focused on eradicating crops such as coca for cocaine production and opium for the production of, for example, morphine, heroin, the opioids. So either law enforcement, eradication, interdiction, criminal justice approaches, or an approach which we call alternative development, which is trying to address the drivers of engagement in the drug trade. Why do people participate? Why do people cultivate narcotic drugs and traffic them? What's been very, very important over the last 20 years, and specifically since a landmark document in 1998 by the United Nations, has been recognition that it is poverty which is the key driver of engagement in the drug trade. So what we've had is a greater institutional emphasis within the UNODC on the importance of alternative development. Now, this has been very well received in the drug policy reform community and people who are very much focused on trying to understand how we can better eliminate this trade in narcotic drugs by tackling it at cause. But the problem that we have is that these alternative development projects, even though we're seeing them rolled out, even though we're seeing more donor investment in alternative development projects, is a very serious concern that these may actually be causing more harm than good. Now, when we look at somewhere like Afghanistan, where we've had, for example, over $7.5 billion spent by the US on counter-narcotics projects, we have the astonishing result that between 2012 and 2013, we had a 36% increase in the amount of opium being cultivated. There is obviously something going very, very seriously wrong with the types of AD projects that are being implemented. Some of the key issues which we need to look at is how is alternative development evaluated? What we're seeing, if we look back at some of these AD projects, is that they are not judged by development indicators. They are actually judged by how much they reduce drug crop volumes, drug crop cultivation. You cannot have a development approach which continues to be framed by goals of drug prohibition. So the whole metrics of the system are based around drugs. They're not based around development. We have incoherence in donor projects. We have ongoing problems of a lack of specialism, of expertise. We have people who are really engaged in AD projects who come from law enforcement backgrounds. These are not development practitioners. And we have this final, persistent and ongoing problem that the people who are engaged in the trade are, under the terms of the conventions, criminals. You cannot engage in development practice stakeholders, which are the cultivators, if essentially we continue to see these people as criminals. So as long as we continue to be framed by prohibition goals, law enforcement approaches, we're simply not going to achieve what we hope to achieve through alternative development. And to reiterate this message, alternative development may actually be causing far more harm than good. Now, drugs are a development issue. The whole issue with the prohibition model is that it is focused on reducing supply from source countries. So this means that some of the poorest, the most fragile, conflict-prone countries of the world are in the front line of northern demands for enforcement efforts. So what we're seeing is that countries like Colombia, increasingly countries of West Africa, obviously Afghanistan, is that these states are being required to commit huge amounts of their budgets to law enforcement, to policing, to criminal justice systems. These are the countries that can least afford to be putting this kind of public revenue into these forms of criminal justice and law enforcement responses. This money needs to be going into development objectives, into education, into health, into schooling. It is a travesty, and essentially the global north is outsourcing the cost of its drug war to those countries of the world that can least afford it. Drugs are a development issue, and it really is essential that the development community engage with drugs as a development issue. What we really want the development community, development agencies, development NGOs to engage with is the fact that the enabling conditions for a thriving drug trade are development related. What we are desperately encouraging the development community to acknowledge is that the enabling conditions, as I said, have to be addressed before we can start moving ahead with issues around law enforcement, criminal justice, prohibition. It's only when we tackle poverty, marginalisation, exclusion that we can begin to push back the advances that we've seen that the drug trade has made in some of the least developed and the poorest countries of the world. What we are suggesting to the development community is that they really have to recognise with us that the drug trade and the presence of the drug trade is a symptom. It is not the cause of the poverty and the violence and the instability, which in effect puts the development community off working in these areas. We really need their engagement in these areas because it is essential for us to achieve these development objectives. Now, the big problem we have with the development community is that the development community has, in effect, marginalised itself from these policy debates. There is this continued emphasis on drugs as a law enforcement, as a security issue. Unfortunately, and I think to a great cost in terms of the MDGs, we actually saw the original Millennium Development Goals reiterating this idea that we should be fighting drugs. Fighting and development are completely contradictory processes. So what we're really hoping to do ahead of this very, very important UNGAS 2016 special session and in terms of the 2015 elucidation of the new MDGs, the new global development priorities, is we need to see the development community engaging with these debates around drugs. We need to see the development community gathering with us the empirical evidence that the war on drugs has devastating costs for development, that it deprives poor countries of resources, that it targets marginal communities, and that it is really a completely counterproductive approach if we want to achieve development goals, if we want to really reach the poorest of the poor and advance global development agendas. We cannot persist with a prohibition paradigm. So really we need to appeal and work with the development community and encourage them to engage with these issues around access to justice, around human rights, around access to essential medicines, which currently are prohibited, are huge impediments to access to these issues because of this prohibition model. So bringing the development community in and encouraging the development community to recognise its role and responsibilities, a shared responsibility, is really essential ahead of 2015 and of course the 2016 UNGAS.
All right, I just want to, before I introduce our last speaker, I just want to pull out one thing I think several of our speakers mentioned. There is a UN General Assembly special session on drugs in 2016. It's probably the best opportunity in a generation to revisit the conventions and revisit how they're implemented. And civil society's voice really needs to be strong there. So our final speaker of the panel is Martin Drury, who's the Director of Health Poverty Action.
So, last speaker, which microphone? These, can you hear me? Yeah, good. It's fantastic, really refreshing presentations to follow. Well, I love being in this kind of gathering. There's something about the people you feel that you can change the world just being alongside them. You probably noticed Julia, I think she mentioned that she'd quite like the development community to get involved with the issue. And I mean, she means that's us, that would be us. And Medact is 50% works on UK issues, 50% global health justice issues. Health Poverty Action, we're pretty much completely in the international development sector. So all of us here, we're part of the development sector. So it's us she's talking to. Now, so I was at a... I'm really tired today, so I'm heavily overly caffeinated. Okay, so I'm going to watch carefully that I don't overrun. But I've got 10 to 15 minutes, and then we're nearly done. I'm on the board of an organisation called Tipping Point, and what it does, it helps filmmakers, movie makers, make films about radical issues that might not get made otherwise. And at one board meeting, we had a guy called Shane Ward that was coming along to try and get a film made about the problems caused by prohibition, drug prohibition as a dominant paradigm for drug control worldwide. And one of the things that he said was that they would love it if they could get an international development NGO, when the film's launched, to work with them. Now, normally, I've worked in international development NGOs for 20 years. You dream of that. You spend fortunes on press officers and everything else trying to get in the media, to get a movie maker saying, will you work with us to really mobilise the UK public and get huge profile for this issue. You dream of that. And yet he's saying, but we know we'd never get it. So the question is why? And just to be clear, development, we're talking here about the development communities. We don't mean DFID, we don't mean the World Bank, we don't mean government agencies. We're talking about NGOs like Oxfam, ActionAid, Christian Aid, Health Poverty Action, Medact, we're talking about those. So why did you think it was totally inconceivable that we'd be able to get a development NGO to put the name to an issue like this? I'm going to come back to that. Now, first of all then, just to remind us, why does it matter? Okay, so remember the Make Poverty a History campaign, which I thought was an awful campaign in a lot of ways, but it a lot wrong with it politically, but I think nevertheless it got profile. But it did show the reach and the mobilisation power of the development sector when we come together. And you remember that's again, I didn't like the advert, but that celebrities clicking their fingers every 3 seconds to symbolise a child dying. And if you look at the Make Poverty History campaign, as I say, I thought it was really shallow. I thought it co-opted by the government in a lot of ways. But actually the policies beneath it were actually pretty good. And they identified a lot of the key causes of that, which were things like the need for debt cancellation, a lot about trade. That message didn't come across very much, but a lot about trade. Today you talk a lot about tax justice, you talk a lot about climate justice, and yet never on that list do you see drug policy reform. Now, what I want to say is that to come up with a list like that and not include the war on drugs is ludicrous. It feels like it's a fringe issue, even as I'm saying it now. It feels a bit like a fringe issue. Sure, poor farmers grow drugs. Of course, development and drug policy people ought to talk to each other. Of course, it's interconnected. But actually, we're not talking about the connection between drug policy and development. We're talking about prohibition. That treating drug use as something that is a criminal issue, that policy, we're talking about the consequences of that on global poverty, on development. Now, why does it matter so much? Well, first of all, for development, it's about education, it's about health systems, it's about healthcare, it's about food security, it's about economic development. Those are the things. Those are the reasons for such suffering, such global injustice. And a fundamental prerequisite for that is that you have the governments of the country have sufficient resources to be able to deliver strong health systems, strong education systems, and secondly, that that they're accountable, that they're not corrupt, that they're reasonably efficient, that their priorities actually are about education systems and development systems and building strengthening their country. The war on drugs makes that an impossibility. You just look at the state of so many Latin American states. What chance is there for a decent health system in that circumstance? Now, if you care about development, you're therefore looking at the poorest and most marginalised communities. Now, what they need even more to advocate for their rights is accountable governance. They needed to have some democratic rights. What chance, if the political system is through a mixture of bribery and intimidation, is under the control of drug cartels? And what chance, even if you had an accountable government, what chance has it got of finding the political space and the financial revenue to strengthen all these systems if it's actually in the middle of a civil war with drug cartels that have got more financial resources than it has? So it's not a fringe development issue, it's a devastatingly important development issue. And globally, the money spent prosecuting the war on drugs it's $100 billion a year, and that's just the initial cost. When you start dealing with mopping up all the consequences of the way it's spent, then it's huge, huge, huge. The global aid budget is about $130 billion a year. So the lost resources financially are phenomenal. So if you think, say in Guatemala, one of the countries that Health Poverty Action has programs in, the expenditure per capita per year on health is about $186. So that translates to about $2.5 billion a year on health. I don't know how much it spends. We haven't got the figures, but it probably spends a lot more than that fighting the war on drugs. Imagine that you actually had a more accountable, more efficient, a good government in Guatemala, free of having to wait out that war, and those resources freed for more productive use. Imagine the impact as well that would have on the economic development of the country. So that, its development wasn't held back because of local political and violent environment. Within 5 to 10 years, what scope would there be for improving the effectiveness of the health system? How many fold more efficient could it be? The transformation could be dramatic. Looking at it the other way, what chances are there of improving the health system in that way without changing the current drug policy, without changing something? Now, the final point is, again, in development, it's very often to say, well, okay, your mind is instantly drawn to the tens of thousands of people that are killed each year because of the drug wars. And you think, okay, well, that's horrible, but it's not, it's not a child every 3 seconds. And we've got to shift, actually. It's about the fundamental impact it has on development. And it's not just the middle-income Latin America countries, as one of the earlier speakers said. It's shifting to Africa. Now, if this problem has done what it's done to middle-income, comparatively strong Latin American states, what is it going to do to Africa? What is it going to do to Sierra Leone? What's it going to do to these fledgling states who are just trying to build from almost nothing, in many instances, a health system, an education system? So they're the top line issues. Now, I'm going to go through them. I'm not even going to go through them. I'm just going to list them. There's a load of other factors as well. The pollution and deforestation that built into the factored into the costs of drug production. The fact that so many crops will get eradicated particularly affects the indigenous communities, because then the production tends to go into even more remote areas. I've talked about the violent crime. There's also evidence that drug cartels, they need poorer marginalised areas to be poorer marginalised in order to traffic through them. They don't want them developed with lots of more activity around. So they use their influence to keep them that way. Drug production undermines more sustainable agriculture and food production. It displaces farmers producing things that would be more useful for development. If you've got drugs being trafficked through a country, produced locally, of course that leads to more local drug addiction. Lots of examples of farmers getting paid in drugs. Literally, that's their wages. They get paid in drugs. And then as for lost tax, the development community, we campaign a lot on tax justice. We also campaign a lot about corporate regulation. Yet one of the biggest trading sectors in the world is neither taxed nor regulated. And we say nothing about it. I could go on, but I can't. So basically, what do we want? It's coming back to that issue. So why then is the development sector quiet? Are we really that scared of a few Daily Mail headlines? And I thought, no, we welcome controversy. That's what we seek it. And indeed, often we do. And actually, I've found, as I've been trying to argue for my own organisation, we are now active in it, but for other NGOs, I think there is a bit of a fear about the controversy. But I don't think it's that simple, actually. I think it's also that organisations don't make decisions about what they're going to work on in logical ways. They've got momentum. They've got an institutional momentum. When I was head of campaigns at Christian Aid, we'd got lots of people that were working on particular issues. And when, okay, there's another opportunity to make something a big campaign, everyone's lobbying for their issue to be the focus of that campaign. We haven't got anyone working on drug policy. You know, it's as simple as that. So I think what I found, shortly after that board meeting at the tipping point, we were invited, a few representatives of the development sector, to a meeting hosted by President Cardoso of Brazil, lobbying us again to take up the drug policy issue, and a few heads of state, you know, a lot of senior political figures lobbying the development sector to take it up. And for half my working life, while I've been working in development campaigning, you're constantly searching for something you could campaign on that is winnable and would make a profound difference to development. And here you had, being presented, an opportunity that in all those years I've never really thought of. You know, and it's the most exciting thing possible. You know, it's like there's a huge gold nugget. You know, why have we left this to the last session? You know, why are we closing the conference with this? It's like there's a huge gold nugget lying on the ground, and no one's thought to pick it up, you know? And for Medact and Health Poverty Action, this is a huge opportunity for us, you know, with your health expertise, our global networks, our foot in the health sector, our foot in the development sector, Health Poverty Action's programs worldwide. We can't take on the US and the G8 to change the war of drugs, but what we can do, we can be pivotal in mobilizing the development sector. And it's not me as a representative of the development sector saying it, it's Julia and others. You know, we have transformed the global paradigm on debt cancellation. You know, it used to be believed just 15 years ago it was believed that if a state's debt was cancelled, the whole global economic system would go into meltdown and it would be the end of everything. That hasn't happened. You know, lots of trade justice reforms, tax justice, you know, financial transaction taxes, the Robin Hood tax campaign. You know, as a network, we've got huge power and huge reach. Now, we, between us, if we were to start listing the development sector organisations we've got contact with, we'd soon get, you know, quite a few routes into the main ones. You know, which have got connections with Oxfam, ActionAid, Christian Aid. You know, if we start lobbying them, look, take this up. We've got a huge opportunity in 2016, and we really have. We can make such a difference. Actually, I'm going to close the conference in a few minutes. So my next little anecdote, partly because we're out of time, I'll tell then. But that's the main thing to end up. First of all, with passion, you know, the suffering because of poverty, you know, because of global poverty, injustice, lack of development that is caused by the war on drugs is beyond tragic, beyond obscene. The flip side of that is that if you can bring change, then the difference made is beyond exciting. And the incredibly exciting thing about this is it's a door that, from the development sector's point of view, hasn't yet been pushed. So the first push can go a hell of a long way, and that's what we can help it do.
I'm afraid we're out of time, but we can continue the conversation at the social, at the Greek restaurant. I just wanted to say thank you again to our panelists.
Hey, don't go away yet now.
We're up to 798. So some of you have obviously joined. Two more, you know, we're over 800. And just as individual people, and it's one of the many voices, I'm so delighted with what you just said, because all of us together can
Yeah.
make a difference to this, and it does seem to me it's something which is just so plainly mad. It ought to be sorted out.
It is. Don't go yet, because I've got no one introduces me. But now there's a different thing. This is just the 5 minutes to close the conference, to thank everyone, and so forth. So first of all, fantastic thank you to Victor, who's organised so much of the conference. Those of you who want to, all of you if you wish, but I can't, but those of you who want to, Yelusa, the Greek tavern round the corner in Woburn Place. We haven't done any feedback forms, but we would welcome feedback. Just email info@medact.org. And then it'd be great to know what you think. And now finally, the two important messages to end with. One is that, and it's the hardest thing for a campaigner to do, to talk about fundraising. But I do want to say something about the partnership between Medact and Health Poverty Action. We've talked a lot today about the People's Health Movement, which is a big, it's a powerful global movement. And those two organisations are structurally part of it. It's not just that we happen to believe in similar things. We're structurally linked into it. That's why, we're sister organisations, so we work together. And organisations, the building up of organisations is important. It's the movement which is what change comes from. And I'm an activist, not an NGO employee by heart. But nevertheless, the building up the organisations really matters. And Medact and Health Poverty Action are both kind of medium-sized organisations. If you look at us, yeah, sure, we spend lots of money around the world, but that's mostly restricted grants. We can only spend it on those things. The core money to do this kind of stuff, the political activism. We don't have much of that at all. So there's an initiative which we want to encourage as many of you as possible to take part in, to raise money for both organisations. You've got a leaflet about it, which is Give Up to Give Back. So the challenge is to stop doing something. It could be something unhealthy, it could be smoking, it could be anything, but stop doing it for at least a week and instead give that money to the Give Up to Give Back initiative. If you really, somebody's telling me I've got to give up lattes for a week. I don't know if I can do that. But if you can't, then you can just give the money anyway and don't give it up. But in that case, you have to give double. So, and actually to give it, the way to do it, if you go to Health Poverty Action's website and don't give to Health Poverty Action, click on the bit that's for the Give Up to Give Back, and then that will get split between the two organisations. Or just send it to either organisation and say it's that, and we'll divide it up and so forth. So that, yeah, if you can encourage others to join Medact, encourage others to join Medact, go to Health Poverty Action's website, sign up for the email campaign lists. We need people to do email campaign actions. So just go and register. Get involved with both organisations if you can and help us build them. Because it's a resource for us, it's a resource for the movement. Finally, just imagine that tomorrow the governments, the most powerful governments of the world assembled together and issued a statement that said that the right to health is something that must be shared equally by all people. Imagine they did that. Imagine that they recognised that achieving that health justice required achieving social and economic justice worldwide. Imagine they said that. And then imagine that they said that military expenditure worldwide should be scaled down and instead channeled into healthcare. Wouldn't that be something? Now that's what the movement that we're part of made happen. That happened. 1978, Alma Ata, that happened. This movement made it happen. So global capitalism, you better not mess with us because we're powerful. And that happened in 1978. Some of those activists that brought it about are still with us. And make no mistake, sure, you know, the forces of oppression grew again. But at that time, and since, the People's Health Movement worldwide has achieved great things. It's made great strides. And today, today's generation, we take our part in the history of that movement. We're the primary healthcare movement of today. We're the People's Health Movement. Thanks for being part of it. Let's see what we can achieve together. Give yourselves a round of applause.